Chapter 26. Seen and Unforeseen. Luna said vaguely that she did not know how soon Rita's interview with Harry would appear in the Quibbler, that her father was expecting a lovely long article on recent sightings of crumple-horned snorkax, and of course that'll be a very important story, so Harry's might have to wait for the following issue, said Luna. Harry had not found it an easy experience to talk about the night when Voldemort had returned. Rita had pressed him for every little detail, and he had given her everything he could remember, knowing that this was his big opportunity to tell the world the truth. He wondered how people would react to the story. He guessed that it would confirm a lot of people in the view that he was completely insane, not least because his story would be appearing alongside utter rubbish about crumple-horned snorkax. But the breakout of Bellatrix Lestrange and her fellow Death Eaters had given Harry a burning desire to do something, whether or not it worked. "Can't wait to see what Umbridge thinks of you going public," said Dean, sounding awestruck at dinner on Monday night. Seamus was shoveling down large amounts of chicken and ham pie on Dean's other side, but Harry knew he was listening. "It's the right thing to do, Harry," said Neville, who was sitting opposite him. He was rather pale, but went on in a low voice. "It must have been tough, talking about it, was it?" "Yeah," mumbled Harry, "but people have got to know what Voldemort's capable of, haven't they?" "That's right," said Neville, nodding. "And his Death Eaters too. People should know." Neville left his sentence hanging and returned to his baked potato. Seamus looked up, but when he caught Harry's eye, he looked quickly back at his plate again. After a while, Dean, Seamus and Neville departed for the common room, leaving Harry and Hermione at the table waiting for Ron, who had not yet had dinner because of Quidditch practice. Cho Chang walked into the hall with her friend Marietta. Harry's stomach gave an unpleasant lurch, but she did not look over at the Gryffindor table and sat down with her back to him. "Oh, I forgot to ask you," said Hermione brightly, glancing over at the Ravenclaw table. "What happened on your date with Cho? How come you were back so early?" Well... "It was," said Harry, pulling a dish of rhubarb crumble towards him and helping himself to seconds. "A complete fiasco, now you mention it." And he told her what had happened in Madame Puddifoot's tea shop. "So then," he finished several minutes later, as the final bit of crumble disappeared, "she jumps upright and says, 'I'll see you around, Harry,' and runs out the place." He put down his spoon and looked at Hermione. "I mean, what was all that about? What was going on?" Hermione glanced over at the back of Cho's head and sighed. "Oh, Harry," she said sadly. "Well, I'm sorry, but you were a bit tactless." "Me? Tactless?" said Harry, outraged. "One minute we were getting on fine. Next minute she was telling me that Roger Davis asked her about how she used to go and snog Cedric in that stupid tea shop. How was I supposed to feel about that?" "Well, you see," said Hermione, with the patient air of someone explaining that 1 + 1 = 2 to an over-emotional toddler. "You shouldn't have told her that you wanted to meet me halfway through your date." But, spluttered Harry, "but you told me to meet you at 12 and to bring her along. How was I supposed to do that without telling her?" "You should have told her differently," said Hermione, still with that maddeningly patient air. "You should have said it was really annoying, but I'd made you promise to come along to the Free Broomsticks, and you really didn't want to go. You'd much rather spend the whole day with her, but unfortunately you thought you really ought to meet me, and would she please come along with you, and hopefully you'd be able to get away more quickly. And it might have been a good idea to mention how ugly you think I am too," Hermione added, as an afterthought. "But I don't think you're ugly," said Harry, bemused. Hermione laughed. "Harry, you're worse than Ron." "Well, no, you're not," she sighed, as Ron himself came stumping into the hall, splattered with mud and looking grumpy. "Look, you upset Cho when you said you were going to meet me, so she tried to make you jealous. It was her way of trying to find out how much you liked her." "Is that what she was doing?" said Harry, as Ron dropped onto the bench opposite them and pulled every dish within reach towards him. "Well, wouldn't it have been easier if she'd just asked me whether I liked her better than you?" "Girls don't often ask questions like that," said Hermione. "Well, they should," said Harry forcefully. "Then I could have just told her I fancy her, and she wouldn't have had to get herself all worked up again about Cedric dying." "I'm not saying what she did was sensible," said Hermione, as Ginny joined them, just as muddy as Ron and looking equally disgruntled. I'm just trying to make sure you see how she was feeling at the time." "You should write a book," Ron told Hermione as he cut up his potatoes. "Translating mad things girls do so boys can understand them." "Yeah," said Harry fervently, looking over at the Ravenclaw table. Cho had just got up, and still not looking at him, she left the Great Hall. Feeling rather depressed, he looked back at Ron and Ginny. "So, how was Quidditch practice?" "It was a nightmare," said Ron in a surly voice. "Oh, come on," said Hermione, looking at Ginny. "I'm sure it wasn't that." "Yes, it was," said Ginny. "It was appalling. Angelina was nearly in tears by the end of it." Ron and Ginny went off for baths after dinner. Harry and Hermione returned to busy Gryffindor common room and their usual pile of homework. Harry had been struggling with a new star chart for astronomy for half an hour when Fred and George turned up. "Ron and Ginny not here?" asked Fred, looking around as he pulled up a chair, and when Harry shook his head, he said, "Good. We were watching their practice. They're going to be slaughtered. They're complete rubbish without us." "Come on, Ginny's not bad," said George fairly, sitting down next to Fred. "Actually, I don't know how she got so good, seeing how we never let her play with us. She's been breaking into your broom shed in the garden since the age of 6, and taking each of your brooms out in turn when you weren't looking," said Hermione from behind her tottering pile of ancient rune books. "Oh," said George, looking mildly impressed. "Well, that'd explain it." "Has Ron saved a goal yet?" asked Hermione, peering over the top of magical hieroglyphs and logograms. "Well, he can do it if he doesn't think anyone's watching him," said Fred, rolling his eyes. "So all we have to do is ask the crowd to turn their backs and talk among themselves every time the quaffle goes up his end on Saturday." He got up again and moved restlessly to the window, staring out across the dark grounds. "You know, Quidditch was about the only thing in this place worth staying for." Hermione cast him a stern look. "You've got exams coming." "Told you already. We're not fussed about newts," said Fred. "The snack boxes are ready to roll. We found out how to get rid of those boils. Just a couple of drops of Murtlap essence sorts them. Lee put us onto it." George yawned widely and looked out disconsolately at the cloudy night sky. "I don't know if I even want to watch this match. If Zachariah Smith beats us, I might have to kill myself." "Kill him, more like," said Fred firmly. "That's the trouble with Quidditch," said Hermione absent-mindedly, once again bent over her runes translation. "It creates all this bad feeling and tension between the houses." She looked up to find her copy of Spellman's syllabary and caught Fred, George and Harry all staring at her with expressions of mingled disgust and incredulity on their faces. "Well, it does," she said impatiently. "It's only a game, isn't it?" "Hermione," said Harry, shaking his head, "you're good on feelings and stuff, but you just don't understand about Quidditch." "Maybe not," she said darkly, returning to her translation, "but at least my happiness doesn't depend on Ron's goalkeeping ability." And though Harry would rather have jumped off the astronomy tower than admit it to her, by the time he had watched the game the following Saturday, he would have given any number of galleons not to care about Quidditch either. The very best thing you could say about the match was that it was short. The Gryffindor spectators had to endure only 22 minutes of agony. It was hard to say what the worst thing was. Harry thought it was a close-run contest between Ron's 14th failed save, Sloper missing the bludger but hitting Angelina in the mouth with his bat, and Kirk shrieking and falling backwards off his broom when Zachariah Smith zoomed at him carrying the quaffle. The miracle was that Gryffindor only lost by 10 points. Ginny managed to snatch the snitch from right under Hufflepuff Seeker Summerby's nose, so that the final score was 240 versus 230. "Good catch," Harry told Ginny back in the common room, where the atmosphere resembled that of a particularly dismal funeral. "I was lucky," she shrugged. "It wasn't a very fast snitch, and Summerby's got a cold. He sneezed and closed his eyes at exactly the wrong moment. Anyway, once you're back on the team—" "Ginny, I've got a lifelong ban." "You're banned as long as Umbridge is in the school," Ginny corrected him. "There's a difference. Anyway, once you're back, I think I'll try out for Chaser. Angelina and Alicia are both leaving next year, and I prefer goal-scoring to seeking anyway." Harry looked over at Ron, who was hunched in a corner, staring at his knees, a bottle of butterbeer clutched in his hand. "Angelina still won't let him resign," Ginny said, as though reading Harry's mind. "She says she knows he's got it in him." Harry liked Angelina for the faith she was showing in Ron, but at the same time thought it would really be kinder to let him leave the team. Ron had left the pitch to another booming chorus of "Weasley is our king," sung with great gusto by the Slytherins, who were now favourites to win the Quidditch Cup. Fred and George wandered over. "Haven't even got the heart to take the mickey out of him," said Fred, looking over at Ron's crumpled figure. "Mind you, when he missed the 14th, he made wild motions with his arms, as though doing an upright doggy paddle. Well, I'll save it for parties, eh?" Ron dragged himself up to bed shortly after this. Out of respect for his feelings, Harry waited a while before going to the dormitory himself, so that Ron could pretend to be asleep if he wanted to. Sure enough, when Harry finally entered the room, Ron was snoring a little too loudly to be entirely plausible. Harry got into bed, thinking about the match. It had been immensely frustrating watching from the sidelines. He was quite impressed by Ginny's performance, but he knew if he had been playing, he could have caught the snitch sooner. There had been a moment when it had been fluttering near Kirk's ankle. If Ginny hadn't hesitated, she might have been able to scrape a win for Gryffindor. Umbridge had been sitting a few rows below Harry and Hermione. Once or twice she had turned squatly in her seat to look at him, her wide toad's mouth stretched in what he thought had been a gloating smile. The memory of it made him feel hot with anger as he lay there in the dark. After a few minutes, however, he remembered that he was supposed to be emptying his mind of all emotion before he slept, as Snape kept instructing him at the end of every occlumency lesson. He tried for a moment or two, but the thought of Snape on top of memories of Umbridge merely increased his sense of grumbling resentment, and he found himself focusing instead on how much he loathed the pair of them. Slowly Ron's snores died away, to be replaced by the sound of deep, slow breathing. It took Harry much longer to get to sleep. His body was tired, but it took his brain a long time to close down. He dreamed that Neville and Professor Sprout were waltzing around the room of requirement, while Professor McGonagall played the bagpipes. He watched them happily for a while, and then decided to go and find the other members of the DA. But when he left the room, he found himself facing not the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, but a torch burning in its bracket on a stone wall. He turned his head slowly to the left. There, at the far end of the windowless passage, was a plain black door. He walked towards it with a sense of mounting excitement. He had the strangest feeling that this time he was going to get lucky at last and find the way to open it. He was feet from it and saw with a leap of excitement that there was a glowing strip of faint blue light down the right-hand side. The door was ajar. He stretched out his hand to push it wide and... Ron gave a loud, rasping, genuine snore, and Harry awoke abruptly, with his right hand stretched in front of him in the darkness, to open a door that was hundreds of miles away. He let it all fall with a feeling of mingled disappointment and guilt. He knew he should not have seen the door, but at the same time felt so consumed with curiosity about what was behind it that he could not help feeling annoyed with Ron. If only he could have saved his snore for just another minute. They entered the great hall for breakfast at exactly the same moment as the post owls on Monday morning. Hermione was not the only person eagerly awaiting her daily profit. Nearly everyone was eager for more news about the escaped Death Eaters, who, despite many reported sightings, had still not been caught. She gave the delivery owl a nut and unfolded the newspaper eagerly, while Harry helped himself to orange juice. As he had only received one note during the entire year, he was sure, when the first owl landed with a thud in front of him, that it had made a mistake. "Who are you after?" he asked, languidly removing his orange juice from underneath its beak and leaning forwards to see the recipient's name and address. "Harry Potter, Great Wall, Hogwarts School." Frowning, he made to take the letter from the owl, but before he could do so, 3, 4, 5 more owls had fluttered down beside it and were jockeying for position, treading in the butter and knocking over the salt as each one attempted to give him their letter first. "What's going on?" Ron asked in amazement, as the whole of Gryffindor table leaned forwards to watch, and another 7 owls landed against the first ones, screeching, hooting and flapping their wings. "Harry," said Hermione breathlessly, plunging her hands into the feathery mass and pulling out a screech owl bearing a long, cylindrical package. "I think I know what this means. Open this one first." Harry ripped off the brown packaging. Out rolled a tightly furled copy of the March edition of the Quibbler. He unrolled it to see his own face grinning sheepishly at him from the front cover. In large red letters across the picture were the words, Harry Potter speaks out at last. The truth about he who must not be named and the night I saw him return." "It's good, isn't it?" said Luna, who had drifted over to the Gryffindor table and now squeezed herself onto the bench between Fred and Ron. "It came out yesterday. I asked Dad to send you a free copy. I expect all these—" She waved a hand at the assembled owls, still scrabbling around on the table in front of Harry. "Are letters from readers?" "That's what I thought," said Hermione eagerly. "Harry, do you mind if we—" "Help yourself," said Harry, feeling slightly bemused. Ron and Hermione both started ripping open envelopes. "This one's from a bloke who thinks you're off your rockers," said Ron, glancing down his letter. "Ah, well. This woman recommends you try a good course of shock spells at St Mungo's," said Hermione, looking disappointed and crumpling up a second. "This one looks okay, though," said Harry slowly, scanning a long letter from a witch in Paisley. "Hey, she says she believes me." "This one's in two minds," said Fred, who had joined in the letter opening with enthusiasm. "Says you don't come across as a mad person, but he really doesn't want to believe you know who's back, so he doesn't know what to think now. Blimey, what a waste of parchment." "Here's another one. Another one you're convinced, Harry." "You've convinced," said Hermione excitedly. "Having read your side of the story, I'm forced to the conclusion that the Daily Prophet has treated you very unfairly. Little though I want to think that he who must not be named has returned, I am forced to accept that you are telling the truth. Oh, this is wonderful." "Another one who thinks you're barking," said Ron, throwing a crumpled letter over his shoulder. "But this one says you've got her converted, and she now thinks you're a real hero. She's put in a photograph too. Wow!" "What is going on here?" said a falsely sweet, girlish voice. Harry looked up with his hands full of envelopes. Professor Umbridge was standing behind Fred and Luna, her bulging toad's eyes scanning the mass and mess of owls and letters on the table in front of Harry. Behind her, he saw many of the students watching them avidly. "Why have you got all these letters, Mr. Potter?" she asked slowly. "Is that a crime now?" said Fred loudly. "Getting mail?" "Be careful, Mr. Weasley, or I shall have to put you in detention," said Umbridge. "Well, Mr. Potter?" Harry hesitated, but he did not see how he could keep what he had done quiet. It was surely only a matter of time before a copy of the Quiddler came to Umbridge's attention. "People have written to me because I gave an interview," said Harry, "about what happened to me last June." For some reason, he glanced up at the staff table as he said this. Harry had the strangest feeling that Dumbledore had been watching him a second before, but when he looked towards the headmaster, he seemed to be absorbed in conversation with Professor Flitwick. "An interview?" repeated Umbridge, her voice thinner and higher than ever. "What do you mean?" "I mean a reporter asked me questions, and I answered them," said Harry. "Here!" And he threw the copy of the Quibbler to her. She caught it and stared down at the cover, her pale, doughy face turning an ugly, patchy violet. "When did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Last Hogsmeade weekend," said Harry. She looked up at him, incandescent with rage, the magazine shaking in her stubby fingers. "There will be no more Hogsmeade trips for you, Mr. Potter," she whispered. "How you dare! How you could!" She took a deep breath. "I have tried again and again to teach you not to tell lies. The message apparently has still not sunk in. 50 points from Gryffindor and another week's worth of detentions." She stalked away, clutching the Quibbler to her chest, the eyes of many students following her. By mid-morning, enormous signs had been put up all over the school, not just on house notice boards, but in the corridors and classrooms too. By order of the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, any student found in possession of the magazine The Quibbler will be expelled. The above is in accordance with Educational Decree number 27, signed Dolores Jane Umbridge, High Inquisitor. For some reason, every time Hermione caught sight of one of these signs, she beamed with pleasure. "What exactly are you so happy about?" Harry asked her. "Oh, Harry, don't you see?" Hermione breathed. "If she could have done one thing to make absolutely sure that every single person in this school will read your interview, it was banning it." And it seemed that Hermione was quite right. By the end of the day, though Harry had not seen so much as a corner of the Quibbler anywhere in the school, the whole place seemed to be quoting the interview to each other. Harry heard them whispering about it as they queued up outside classes, discussing it over lunch and in the back of lessons, while Hermione even reported that every occupant of the cubicles in the girls' toilets had been talking about it when she nipped in there before ancient runes. Then they spotted me, and obviously they know I know you, so they bombarded me with questions, Hermione told Harry, her eyes shining. And Harry, I think they believe you. I really do. I think you've finally got them convinced. Meanwhile, Professor Umbridge was stalking the school, stopping students at random and demanding that they turn out their books and pockets. Harry knew she was looking for copies of the Quibbler, but the students were several steps ahead of her. The pages carrying Harry's interview had been bewitched to resemble extracts from textbooks if anyone but themselves read it, or else wiped magically blank until they wanted to peruse it again. Soon it seemed that every single person in the school had read it. The teachers were of course forbidden from mentioning the interview by Educational Decree number 26, but they found ways to express their feelings about it all the same. Professor Sprout awarded Gryffindor 20 points when Harry passed her a watering can. A beaming Professor Flitwick pressed a box of squeaking sugar mice on him at the end of Charms, said "shh" and hurried away. And Professor Trelawney broke into hysterical sobs during divination and announced to the startled class and a very disapproving Umbridge that Harry was not going to suffer an early death after all, but would live to a ripe old age, become Minister of Magic and have 12 children. But what made Harry happiest was Cho catching up with him as he was hurrying along to Transfiguration the next day. Before he knew what had happened, her hand was in his and she was breathing in his ear. "I'm really, really sorry. The interview was so brave. It made me cry." He was sorry to hear she had shed even more tears over it, but very glad they were on speaking terms again, and even more pleased when she gave him a swift kiss on the cheek and hurried off again. And unbelievably, no sooner had he arrived outside Transfiguration than something just as good happened. Seamus stepped out of the queue to face him. I just wanted to see," he mumbled, squinting at Harry's left knee. I believe you, and I've sent a copy of that magazine to me mam." If anything more was needed to complete Harry's happiness, it was the reaction he got from Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle. He saw them with their heads together later that afternoon in the library. They were with a weedy-looking boy Hermione whispered was called Theodore Knott. They looked around at Harry as he browsed the shelves for the book he needed on partial vanishment. Goyle cracked his knuckles threateningly, and Malfoy whispered something undoubtedly malevolent to Crabbe. Harry knew perfectly well they were acting like this. He had named all their fathers as Death Eaters. "And the best bit," whispered Hermione gleefully as they left the library, "is they can't contradict you, because they can't admit they've read the article." To cap it all, Luna told him over dinner that no issue of the Quibbler had ever sold out faster. "Dad's reprinting," she told Harry, her eyes popping excitedly. "He can't believe it. He says people seem even more interested in this than the Crumplehorn Snorkax." Harry was a hero in the Gryffindor common room that night. Daringly, Fred and George had put an enlargement charm on the front cover of the Quibbler and hung it onto the wall, so that Harry's giant head gazed down upon the proceedings, occasionally saying things like, "The Ministry are morons," and "Eat dung, Umbridge," in a booming voice. Hermione did not find this very amusing. She said it interfered with her concentration, and she ended up going to bed early out of irritation. Harry had to admit that the poster was not quite as funny after an hour or two, especially when the talking spell had started to wear off, so that it merely shouted disconnected words like "dung" and "Umbridge" at more and more frequent intervals in a progressively higher voice. In fact, it started to make his head ache, and his scar began prickling uncomfortably again. To disappointed moans from the many people who were sitting around him, asking him to relive his interview for the umpteenth time, he announced that he too needed an early night. The dormitory was empty when he reached it. He rested his forehead for a moment against the cool glass of the window beside his bed. It felt soothing against his scar. Then he undressed and got into bed, wishing his headache would go away. He also felt slightly sick. He rolled over onto his side, closed his eyes and fell asleep almost at once. He was standing in a dark, curtained room, lit by a single branch of candles. His hands were clenched on the back of a chair in front of him. They were long, fingered and white, as though they had not seen sunlight for years, and looked like large, pale spiders against the dark velvet of the chair. Beyond the chair, in a pool of light cast upon the floor by the candles, knelt a man in black robes. "I have been badly advised, it seems," said Harry in a high, cold voice that pulsed with anger. "Master, I crave your pardon," croaked the man kneeling on the floor. The back of his head glimmered in the candlelight. He seemed to be trembling. "I do not blame you, Rookwood," said Harry in that cold, cruel voice. He relinquished his grip on the chair and walked around it, closer to the man cowering on the floor, until he stood directly over him in the darkness, looking down from a far greater height than usual. "You are sure of your facts, Rookwood?" "Rookwood?" asked Harry. "Yes, my lord, yes. I used to work in the department after all. Avery told me Bode would be able to remove it. Bode would never have taken it, master. Bode would have known he could not, undoubtedly. That is why he fought so hard against Malfoy's imperious curse." "Stand up, Rookwood," whispered Harry. The kneeling man almost fell over in his haste to obey. His face was pock-marked. The scars were thrown into relief by the candlelight. He remained a little stooped when standing, as though halfway through a bow, and he darted terrified looks up at Harry's face. "You have done well to tell me this," said Harry. "Very well. I have wasted months on fruitless schemes, it seems, but no matter. We begin again from now. You have Lord Voldemort's gratitude, Rookwood." "My lord, yes, my lord," gasped Rookwood, his voice hoarse with relief. "I shall need your help. I shall need all the information you can give me." "Of course, my lord, of course, anything." "Very well. You may go. Send Avery to me." Rookwood scurried backwards, bowing, and disappeared through a door. Left alone in the dark room, Harry turned towards the wall. A cracked, aged spot mirror hung on the wall in the shadows. Harry moved towards it. His reflection grew larger and clearer in the darkness. A face, whiter than a skull, red eyes with slits for pupils. "No!" "What?" yelled a voice nearby. Harry flailed around madly, became entangled in the hangings, and fell out of his bed. For a few seconds he did not know where he was. He was convinced he was about to see the white, skull-like face looming at him from the dark again. Then, very near to him, Ron's voice spoke. "Will you stop acting like a maniac so I can get you out of here?" Ron wrenched the hangings apart, and Harry stared up at him in the moonlight, flat on his back, his scar searing with pain. Ron looked as though he had just been getting ready for bed. One arm was out of his robes. "Has someone been attacked again?" asked Ron, pulling Harry roughly to his feet. "Is it Dad? Is it that snake?" "No, everyone's fine," gasped Harry, whose forehead felt as though it were on fire. "Well, Avery isn't. He's in trouble. He gave him the wrong information. Voldemort's really angry." Harry groaned and sank, shaking onto his bed, rubbing his scar. "But Rookwood's going to help him now. He's on the right track again." "What are you talking about?" said Ron, sounding scared. "Do you mean, did you just see you-know-who?" "I was you-know-who," said Harry, and he stretched out his hands in the darkness and held them up to his face, to check that they were no longer deathly white and long-fingered. "He was with Rookwood. He's one of the Death Eaters who escaped from Azkaban. Remember, Rookwood's just told him Bode couldn't have done it." "Done what?" "Remove something. He said Bode would have known he couldn't have done it. Bode was under the imperious curse. I think he said Malfoy's dad put it on him." "Mad. Bode was bewitched to remove something," Ron said. But Harry, that's got to be—" "The weapon." Harry finished the sentence for him. "I know." The dormitory door opened. Dean and Seamus came in. Harry swung his legs back into bed. He did not want to look as though anything odd had just happened, seeing as Seamus had only just stopped thinking Harry was a nutter. "Did you say," murmured Ron, putting his head close to Harry's on the pretence of helping himself to water from the jug on the bedside table, "that you were you-know-who?" "Yes," said Harry quietly. Ron took an unnecessarily large gulp of water. Harry saw it spill over his chin onto his chest. "Harry," he said, as Dean and Seamus clattered around noisily, pulling off their robes and talking. "You've got to tell—" "I haven't got to tell anyone," said Harry shortly. "I wouldn't have seen it at all if I could do occlumency. I'm supposed to have learned to shut this stuff out. That's what they want. But By they he meant Dumbledore. He got back into bed and rolled over onto his side with his back to Ron, and after a while he heard Ron's mattress creak as he too lay back down. Harry's scar began to burn. He bit hard on his pillow to stop himself making a noise. Somewhere, he knew, Avery was being punished. Harry and Ron waited until break next morning to tell Hermione exactly what had happened. They wanted to be absolutely sure they could not be overheard. Standing in their usual corner of the cool and breezy courtyard, Harry told her every detail of the dream he could remember. When he'd finished, she said nothing at all for a few moments, but stared with a kind of painful intensity at Fred and George, who were both headless and selling their magical hats from under their cloaks on the other side of the yard. "So, that's why they killed him," she said quietly, withdrawing her gaze from Fred and George at last. "When Bode tried to steal this weapon, something funny happened to him. I think there must be defensive spells on it, or around it, to stop people touching it. That's why he was in St. Mungo's. His brain had gone all funny, and he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk. But remember what the healer told us. He was recovering, and they couldn't risk him getting better, could they? I mean, the shock of whatever happened when he touched that weapon probably made the Imperious Curse lift. Once he'd got his voice back, he'd explain what he'd been doing, wouldn't he? They would have known he'd been sent to steal the weapon. Of course, it would have been easy for Lucius Malfoy to put the curse on him. Never out of the Ministry, is he? He was even hanging around that day I had my hearing, said Harry, in the... Hang on, he said slowly. He was in the Department of Mysteries corridor that day. Your dad said he was probably trying to sneak down and find out what was happening in my hearing, but what if... Sturgis, gasped Hermione, looking thunderstruck. Sorry, said Ron, looking bewildered. Sturgis Podmore, said Hermione breathlessly. Arrested for trying to get through a door. Lucius Malfoy must have got him too. I bet he did it the day you saw him there. Harry, Sturgis had Moody's invisibility cloak, right? So what if he was standing guard by the door, invisible, and Malfoy heard him move, or guessed someone was there, or just did the Imperious Curse on the off chance there'd be a guard there? So, when Sturgis next had an opportunity, probably when it was his turn on guard duty again, he tried to get into the department to steal the weapon for Voldemort. Ron, be quiet. But he got caught and sent to Azkaban. She gazed at Harry. And now Rookwood's told Voldemort how to get the weapon. I didn't hear all the conversation, but that's what it sounded like, said Harry. Rookwood used to work there. Maybe Voldemort would send Rookwood to do it. Hermione nodded, apparently still lost in thought. Then, quite abruptly, she said, But you shouldn't have seen this at all, Harry. What? He said, taken aback. You're supposed to be learning how to close your mind to this sort of thing, said Hermione, suddenly stern. I know I am, said Harry, but, well, I think we should just try and forget what you saw, said Hermione firmly, and you ought to put a bit more effort on your occlumency from now on. The week did not improve as it progressed. Harry received 2 more D's in potions. He was still on tenterhooks that Hagrid might get the sack, and he couldn't stop himself dwelling on the dream in which he had been Voldemort. Though he didn't bring it up with Ron and Hermione again, he didn't want another telling off from Hermione. He wished very much that he could have talked to Sirius about it, but that was out of the question, so he tried to push the matter to the back of his mind. Unfortunately, the back of his mind was no longer the secure place it had once been. Get up, Potter. A couple of weeks after his dream of Rookwood, Harry was to be found yet again kneeling on the floor of Snape's office, trying to clear his head. He had just been forced yet again to relive a stream of very early memories he had not even realised he still had, most of them concerning humiliations Dudley and his gang had inflicted upon him in primary school. That last memory, said Snape. What was it? I don't know, said Harry, getting wearily to his feet. He was finding it increasingly difficult to disentangle separate memories from the rush of images and sound that Snape kept calling forth. You mean the one where my cousin tried to make me stand in the toilet? No, said Snape softly. I mean the one with a man kneeling in the middle of a darkened room. It's nothing, said Harry. Snape's dark eyes bored into Harry's, remembering what Snape had said about eye contact being crucial to legilimency. Harry blinked and looked away. How do that man and that room come to be inside your head, Potter? Said Snape. It, said Harry, looking everywhere but at Snape. It was just a dream I had. A dream, repeated Snape. There was a pause, during which Harry stared fixedly at a large dead frog suspended in a jar of purple liquid. You do know why you are here, don't you, Potter? Said Snape, in a low, dangerous voice. You do know why I am giving up my evenings to this tedious job? Yes, said Harry stiffly. Remind me why you are here, Potter. So I can learn occlumency, said Harry, now glaring at a dead eel. Correct, Potter, and dim though you may be. Harry looked back at Snape, hating him. I would have thought that after over 2 months of lessons you might have made some progress. How many other dreams about the Dark Lord have you had? Just that one, lied Harry. Perhaps, said Snape, his dark, cold eyes narrowing slightly. Perhaps you actually enjoy having these visions and dreams, Potter. Maybe they make you feel special, important. No, they don't, said Harry, his jaw set and his fingers clenched tightly around the handle of his wand. That is just as well, Potter, said Snape coldly, because you are neither special nor important, and it is not up to you to find out what the Dark Lord is saying to his Death Eaters. No, that's your job, isn't it? Harry shot at him. He had not meant to say it. It had burst out of him in temper. For a long moment they stared at each other, Harry convinced he had gone too far, but there was a curious, almost satisfied expression on Snape's face when he answered. Yes, Potter, he said, his eyes glinting. That is my job. Now, if you are ready, we will start again. He raised his wand. 1, 2, 3. Legilimens! 100 Dementors were swooping towards Harry across the lake in the grounds. He screwed up his face in concentration. They were coming closer. He could see the dark holes beneath their hoods. Yet he could also see Snape standing in front of him, his eyes fixed on Harry's face, muttering under his breath. And somehow Snape was growing clearer, and the Dementors were growing fainter. Harry raised his own wand. Protego! Snape staggered. His wand flew upwards, away from Harry, and suddenly Harry's mind was teeming with memories that were not his. A hook-nosed man was shouting at a cowering woman, while a small dark-haired boy cried in a corner. A greasy-haired teenager sat alone in a dark bedroom, pointing his wand at the ceiling, shooting down flies. A girl was laughing as a scrawny boy tried to mount a bucking broomstick. Enough! Harry felt as though he'd been pushed hard in the chest. He staggered several steps backwards, hit some of the shelves covering Snape's walls, and heard something crack. Snape was shaking slightly, and was very white in the face. The back of Harry's robes was damp. One of the jars behind him had broken when he fell against it. The pickled, slimy thing within was swirling in its draining potion. Reparo! Hissed Snape, and the jar healed itself at once. Well, Potter, that was certainly an improvement. Panting slightly, Snape straightened the pensieve in which he had again stored some of his thoughts before starting the lesson, almost as though he was checking they were still there. I don't remember telling you to use a shield charm, but there is no doubt that it was effective. Harry did not speak. He felt that to say anything might be dangerous. He was sure he had just broken into Snape's memories, that he had just seen scenes from Snape's childhood. It was unnerving to think that the little boy who had been crying as he watched his parents shouting was actually standing in front of him with such loathing in his eyes. Let's try again, shall we? Said Snape. Harry felt a thrill of dread. He was about to pay for what had just happened. He was sure of it. They moved back into position with the desk between them, Harry feeling he was going to find it much harder to empty his mind this time. On the count of 3, then, said Snape, raising his wand once more. 1, 2. Harry did not have time to gather himself together and attempt to clear his mind before Snape cried, Legilimens! He was hurtling along the corridor towards the Department of Mysteries, past the blank stone walls, past the torches. The plain black door was growing ever larger. He was moving so fast he was going to collide with it. He was feet from it, and again he could see that that little chink of faint blue light. The door had flown open. He was through it at last, inside a black-walled, black-floored circular room, lit with blue-flamed candles, and there were more doors all around him. He needed to go on, but which door ought he to take? "Potter!" Harry opened his eyes. He was flat on his back again, and no memory of having got there. He was also panting, as though he really had run the length of the Department of Mysteries corridor, really had sprinted through the black door around the circular room. "Explain yourself," said Snape, who was standing over him, looking furious. I don't know what happened," said Harry truthfully, standing up. There was a lump on the back of his head where he had hit the ground, and he felt feverish. "I've never seen that before. I mean, I told you, I've dreamed about the door, but it's never opened before." "You are not working hard enough." For some reason, Snape seemed even angrier than he had done 2 minutes before, when Harry had seen into the teacher's memories. "You are lazy and sloppy, Potter. It is small wonder that the Dark Lord—" "Can you tell me something, sir?" said Harry, firing up again. "Why do you call Voldemort the Dark Lord? I've only ever heard Death Eaters call him that." Snape opened his mouth in a snarl, and a woman screamed from somewhere outside the room. Snape's head jerked upwards. He was gazing at the ceiling. "What the—" he muttered. Harry could hear a muffled commotion coming from what he thought might be the entrance hall. Snape looked around at him, frowning. "Did you see anything unusual on your way down here, Potter?" Harry shook his head. Somewhere above them the woman screamed again. Snape strode to the office door, his wand still held at the ready, and swept out of sight. Harry hesitated for a moment, and then followed. The screams were indeed coming from the entrance hall. They grew louder as Harry ran towards the stone steps leading up from the dungeons. When he reached the top, he found the entrance hall packed. Students had come flooding out of the great hall, where dinner was still in progress, to see what was going on. Others had crammed themselves onto the marble staircase. Harry pushed forwards through a knot of tall Slytherins and saw that the onlookers had formed a great ring. Some of them looked shocked, others even frightened. Professor McGonagall was directly opposite Harry on the other side of the hall. She looked as though she was watching. What she was watching made her faintly sick. Professor Trelawney was standing in the middle of the entrance hall, with her wand in one hand and an empty sherry bottle in the other, looking utterly mad. Her hair was sticking up on end, her glasses were lopsided, so that one eye was magnified more than the other. Her innumerable shawls and scarves were trailing haphazardly from her shoulders, giving the impression that she was falling apart at the seams. 2 large trunks lay on the floor beside her, one of them upside down. It looked very much as though it had been thrown down the stairs after her. Professor Trelawney was staring, apparently terrified, at something Harry could not see, but which seemed to be standing at the foot of the stairs. "No!" she shrieked. "No! This cannot be happening! It cannot! I refuse to accept it!" "You didn't realise this was coming?" said a high girlish voice, sounding callously amused, and Harry, moving slightly to his right, saw that Trelawney's terrifying vision was nothing other than Professor Umbridge. "Incapable though you are of predicting even tomorrow's weather, you must surely have realised that your pitiful performance during my inspections and lack of any improvement would make it inevitable that you will be sacked." You can't!" howled Professor Trelawney, tears streaming down her face from behind her enormous lenses. You can't sack me. I've been here 16 years. Hogwarts is my home." "It was your home," said Professor Umbridge, and Harry was revolted to see the enjoyment stretching her toad-like face as she watched Professor Trelawney sink, sobbing uncontrollably, onto one of her trunks. "Until an hour ago, when the Minister for Magic countersigned your order of dismissal. Now kindly remove yourself from this hall. You are embarrassing us." But she stood and watched, with an expression of gloating enjoyment, as Professor Trelawney shuddered and moaned, rocking backwards and forwards on her trunk in paroxysms of grief. Harry heard a muffled sob to his left and looked around. Lavender and Parvati were both crying quietly, their arms around each other. Then he heard footsteps. Professor McGonagall had broken away from the spectators, marched straight up to Professor Trelawney, and was patting her firmly on the back while withdrawing a large handkerchief from within her robes. There, Sybil, calm down. Blow your nose on this. It's not as bad as you think now. You are not going to have to leave Hogwarts." "Oh, really, Professor McGonagall?" said Umbridge in a deadly voice. taking a few steps forward. "And your authority for that statement is?" "That would be mine," said a deep voice. The oaken front doors had swung open. Students beside them scuttled out of the way as Dumbledore appeared in the entrance. What he had been doing out of the grounds Harry could not imagine, but there was something impressive about the sight of him framed on the doorway against an oddly misty night. Leaving the doors wide open behind him, he strode forwards through the circle of onlookers towards Professor Trelawney, tear-stained and trembling. On her trunk, Professor McGonagall alongside her. "Yours, Professor Dumbledore?" said Umbridge, with a singularly unpleasant little laugh. "I'm afraid you do not understand the position. I have here," she pulled a parchment scroll from within her robes, "an order of dismissal signed by myself and the Minister for Magic, under the terms of Educational Decree number 23. The High Inquisitor of Hogwarts has the power to inspect, place upon probation, and sack any teacher that is to say I feel is not performing to the standards required by the Ministry of Magic. I have decided that Professor Trelawney is not up to scratch. I have dismissed her." To Harry's very great surprise, Dumbledore continued to smile. He looked down at Professor Trelawney, who was still sobbing and choking on her trunk, and said, "You are quite right, of course, Professor Umbridge. As High Inquisitor, you have every right to dismiss my teachers. You do not, however, have the authority to send them away from the castle, I am afraid," he went on, with a courteous little bow. "The power to do that still resides with the headmaster, and it is my wish that Professor Trelawney continue to live at Hogwarts." At this, Professor Trelawney gave a wild little laugh, in which a hiccup was barely hidden. No, I'll go, Dumbledore. I shall leave Hogwarts and seek my fortune elsewhere." "No," said Dumbledore sharply. "It is my wish that you remain, Sybil." He returned to Professor McGonagall. "Might I ask you to escort Sybil back upstairs, Professor McGonagall?" "Of course," said McGonagall. "Up you get, Sybil." Professor Sprout came hurrying forwards out of the crowd and grabbed Professor Trelawney's other arm. Together they guided her past Umbridge and up the marble stairs. Professor Flitwick went scurrying after them, his wand held out before him. He squeaked, "Locomotor trunks!" and Professor Trelawney's luggage rose into the air and proceeded up the staircase after her, Professor Flitwick bringing up the rear. Professor Umbridge was standing stock still, staring at Dumbledore, who continued to smile benignly. "And what," she said in a whisper that carried all around the entrance hall, "are you going to do with her once I appoint a new divination teacher who needs her lodgings?" "Oh, that won't be a problem," said Dumbledore pleasantly. "You see, I have already found us a new divination teacher, and he will prefer lodgings on the ground floor." "You've found?" said Umbridge shrilly. "You've found? Might I remind you, Dumbledore, that under Educational Decree number 22... "The Ministry has the right to appoint a suitable candidate if, and only if, the headmaster is unable to find one," said Dumbledore, "and I am happy to say that on this occasion I have succeeded. May I introduce you?" He turned to face the open front doors, through which night mist was now drifting. Harry heard hooves. There was a shocked murmur around the hall, and those nearest the doors hastily moved even further backwards, some of them tripping over in their haste to clear a path for the newcomer. Through the mist came a face Harry had seen once before on a dark, dangerous night in the Forbidden Forest. White blonde hair and astonishingly blue eyes, the head and torso of a man joined to the palomino body of a horse. "This is Firenze," said Dumbledore happily to the thunderstruck Umbridge. "I think you'll find him suitable." Chapter 27. The Centaur and the Sneak. "I bet you wish you hadn't given up divination now, don't you, Hermione?" asked Parvati, smirking. It was breakfast time, 2 days after the sacking of Professor Trelawney, and Parvati was curling her eyelashes around her wand and examining the effect in the back of the spoon. They were to have their first lesson with Firenze that morning. "Not really," said Hermione indifferently, who was reading the Daily Prophet. "I've never really liked horses." She turned a page of the newspaper and scanned its columns. "He's not a horse, he's a centaur," said Lavender, sounding shocked. "A gorgeous centaur," sighed Parvati. "Either way, he's still got 4 legs," said Hermione coolly. "Anyway, I thought you two were all upset that Trelawney had gone." "We are," Lavender assured her. We went up to her office to see her. We took her some daffodils, not the honking ones that Sprouts got, nice ones." "How is she?" asked Harry. "Not very good, poor thing," said Lavender sympathetically. "She was crying and saying she'd rather leave the castle forever than stay here where Umbridge is, and I don't blame her. Umbridge was horrible to her, wasn't she?" "I've got a feeling Umbridge has only just started being horrible," said Hermione darkly. "Impossible," said Ron, who was tucking into a large plate of eggs and bacon. "She can't get any worse than she's been already. You mark my words, she's going to want revenge on Dumbledore for appointing a new teacher without consulting her," said Hermione, closing the newspaper. "Especially another part human. You saw the look on her face when she saw Firenze." After breakfast, Hermione departed for her arithmetic class, as Harry and Ron followed Parvati and Lavender into the entrance hall, heading for divination. "Aren't we going up to the North Tower?" asked Ron, looking puzzled, as Parvati bypassed the marble staircase. Parvati looked at him scornfully over her shoulder. "How do you expect Firenze to climb that ladder? We're in classroom 11 now. It was on the notice board yesterday." Classroom 11 was on the ground floor along the corridor leading off the entrance hall from the opposite side to the Great Hall. Harry knew it was one of those classrooms that were never used regularly, and therefore had the slightly neglected feeling of a cupboard or storeroom. When he entered it right behind Ron and found himself in the middle of a forest clearing, he was therefore momentarily stunned. What the... The classroom floor had been springily mossy, and trees were growing out of it. Their leafy branches fanned across the ceiling and windows, so that the room was full of slanting shafts of soft, dappled green light. The students, who had already arrived, were sitting on the earthy floor with their backs resting against tree trunks or boulders, arms wrapped around their knees or folded tightly across their chests, and all looking rather nervous. In the middle of the clearing, where there were no trees, stood Firenze. "Harry Potter," he said, holding out a hand when Harry entered. Hi," said Harry, shaking hands with the centaur, who surveyed him unblinkingly through those astonishingly blue eyes, but did not smile. Good to see you." "And you," said the centaur, inclining his white blonde head. "It was foretold that we would meet again." Harry noticed there was the shadow of a hoofed-shaped bruise on Firenze's chest. As he turned to join the rest of the class on the ground, he saw they were all looking at him in awe, apparently deeply impressed that he was on speaking terms with Firenze, whom they seemed to find intimidating. When the door was closed and the last student had sat down on a tree stump beside the waste paper basket, Firenze gestured around the room. "Professor Dumbledore has kindly arranged the classroom for us," said Firenze, when everyone had settled down, "in imitation of my natural habitat. I would have preferred to teach you in the Forbidden Forest, which was, until Monday, my home, but that is no longer possible." "Please, sir," said Parvati breathlessly, raising her hand. "Why not? We've been in there with Hagrid. We're not frightened." "It is not a question of your bravery," said Firenze, "but of my position. I cannot return to the forest. My herd has banished me." "Herd?" said Lavender in a confused voice, and Harry knew she was thinking of cows. "What? Oh!" Comprehension dawned on her face. "There are more of you," she said, stunned. "Did Hagrid breed you, like the Thestrals?" asked Dean eagerly. Firenze turned his head very slowly to face Dean, who seemed to realise at once that he had said something very offensive. I meant, sorry," he finished in a hushed voice. "Centaurs are not the servants of playthings of humans," said Firenze quietly. There was a pause, and then Parvati raised her hand again. "Please, sir, why have the other centaurs banished you?" "Because I have agreed to work for Professor Dumbledore," said Firenze. "They see this as a betrayal of our kind." Harry remembered how, nearly 4 years ago, the centaur, Bane, had shouted at Firenze for allowing Harry to ride to safety on his back. He had called him a common mule. He wondered whether it had been Bane who had kicked Firenze in the chest. "Let us begin," said Firenze. He swished his long palomino tail, raised his hand towards the leafy canopy overhead, and then lowered it slowly. And as he did so, the light in the room dimmed, so that they now seemed to be sitting in a forest clearing by twilight, and stars appeared on the ceiling. There were oohs and gasps, and Ron said audibly, "Blimey!" "Lie back on the floor," said Firenze in his calm voice, "and observe the heavens." Here is written, for those who can see, the fortune of our races. Harry stretched out on his back and gazed upwards at the ceiling. A twinkling red star winked at him from overhead. I know that you have learned the names of the planets and their moons in astronomy, said Firenz's calm voice, and that you have mapped the stars' progress through the heavens. Centaurs have unravelled the mysteries of these movements over centuries. Our findings teach us that the future may be glimpsed in the sky above us. Professor Trelawney did astrology with us, said Parvati excitedly, raising her hand in front of her so that it stuck up into the air as she lay on her back. Mars causes accidents and burns and things like that. And when it makes an angle to Saturn, like now, she drew a right angle in the air above her. That means people need to be extra careful when handling hot things. That, said Ferenz calmly, is human nonsense. Parvati's hand fell limply to her side. Trivial hurts, tiny human accidents, said Ferenz, as his hooves thudded over the mossy floor. Those are of no more significance than the scurryings of ants to the wide universe, and are unaffected by planetary movements. Professor Trelawney, began Parvati in a hurt and indignant voice, is a human, said Ferenz simply, and is therefore blinkered and fettered by the limitations of your kind. Harry turned his head very slightly to look at Parvati. She looked very offended, as did several of the people surrounding her. Sybil Trelawney may have seen, I do not know, continued Ferenz, and Harry heard the swishing of his tail again as he walked up and down before them. But she wastes her time, in the main, on the self-flattering nonsense humans call fortune-telling. I, however, am here to explain the wisdom of centaurs, which is impersonal and impartial. We watch the skies for the great tides of evil or change that are sometimes marked there. It may take 10 years to be sure of what we are seeing. Ferenz pointed to the red star directly above Harry. In the past decade, the indications have been that the wizard kind is living through nothing more than a brief calm between two wars. Mars, bringer of battle, shines brightly above us, suggesting that the fight must soon break out again. How soon centaurs may attempt to divine by the burning of certain herbs and leaves, by the observation of fume and flame. It was the most unusual lesson Harry had ever attended. They did indeed burn sage and mallow sweet there on the classroom floor, and Ferenz told them to look for certain shapes and symbols in the pungent fumes. But he seemed perfectly unconcerned that not one of them could see any of the signs he described, telling them that humans were hardly ever good at this, that it took centaurs years and years to become competent, and finished by telling them that it was foolish to put too much faith in such things anyway, because even centaurs sometimes read things wrongly. He was nothing like any human teacher Harry had ever had. His priority did not seem to be to teach them what he knew, but rather to impress upon them that nothing, not even centaurs' knowledge, was foolproof. He's not very definite on anything, is he? Said Ron in a low voice as they put out their mallow-sweet fire. I mean, I could do with a few more details about this war we're about to have, couldn't you? The bell rang right outside the classroom door, and everyone jumped. Harry had completely forgotten they were still inside the castle, and quite convinced that he was really in the forest. The class filed out, looking slightly perplexed. Harry and Ron were on the point of following them when Ferenz called, "Harry Potter, a word, please." Harry turned. The centaur advanced a little towards him. Ron hesitated. "You may stay," Ferenz told him, "but close the door, please." Ron hastened to obey. "Harry Potter, you are a friend of Hagrid's, are you not?" said the centaur. "Yes," said Harry. "Then give him a warning from me. His attempt is not working. He would do better to abandon it." "His attempt is not working," Harry repeated blankly. "And he would be better to abandon it," said Ferenz, trotting and nodding. "I would warn Hagrid myself, but I am banished. It would be unwise for me to go near the forest now. Hagrid has troubles enough without a centaur's battle." "But what's Hagrid attempting to do?" said Harry nervously. Ferenz looked at him impassively. "Hagrid has recently rendered me a great service," said Ferenz, "and he has long since earned my respect for the care he shows all living creatures. I shall not betray his secret, but he must be brought to his senses. The attempt is not working. Tell him, Harry Potter. Good day to you." The happiness Harry had felt in the aftermath of the Quibbler interview had long since evaporated, as a dull March blurred into an equally squally April. His life seemed to have become one long series of worries and problems again. Umbridge had continued attending all care of magical creatures lessons, so it had been very difficult to deliver Friends' warning to Hagrid. At last, Harry had managed it by pretending he'd lost his copy of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and doubling back after class one day. When he'd passed on Firenze's message, Hagrid gazed at him for a moment through his puffy, blackened eyes, apparently taken aback, and then he seemed to pull himself together. "Nice bloke, Firenze," he said gruffly, "but he don't know what he's talking about this. The attempt's coming on fine." "Hagrid, what are you up to?" asked Harry seriously. "Because you've got to be careful. Umbridge has already sacked Trelawney, and if you ask me, she's on a roll. If you're doing anything you shouldn't be, you'll be—" "There's things more important than keeping a job," said Hagrid, though his hands shook slightly as he said this, and a basin full of Nile droppings crashed to the floor. "Don't worry about me, Harry. Just get along now. There's a good lad." Harry had no choice but to leave Hagrid mopping up the dung all over his floor, but he felt thoroughly dispirited as he trudged back up to the castle. Meanwhile, as the teachers and Hermione persisted on reminding them, the owls were drawing ever nearer. All the fifth years were suffering from stress to some degree, but Hannah Abbott became the first to receive a calming draft from Madame Pomfrey after she burst into tears during her herbology and sobbed that she was too stupid to take exams and wanted to leave school now. If it had not been for the DA lessons, Harry thought he would have been extremely unhappy. He sometimes felt he was living for the hours he spent in the room of requirement, working hard but thoroughly enjoying himself at the same time, swelling with pride as he looked around at his fellow DA members and saw how far they had come. Indeed, Harry sometimes wondered how Umbridge was going to react when all of the members of the DA received outstanding in their defence against the dark arts owls. They had finally started work on Patronuses, which everybody had been very keen to practice, though as Harry kept reminding them, producing a Patronus in the middle of a brightly lit classroom when they were not under threat was very different from producing it when confronted by something like a Dementor. "Oh, don't be such a killjoy," said Cho brightly, watching the silvery swan-shaped Patronus soar around the room of requirement during their last lesson before Easter. "They're so pretty." "They're not supposed to be pretty. They're supposed to protect you," said Harry patiently. "What we really need is a boggart, or something that's how I learned. I had to conjure a Patronus while the boggart was pretending to be a Dementor." "But that would be really scary," said Lavender, who was shooting puffs of silver vapour out of the end of her wand. "And I still can't do it," she added angrily. Neville was having trouble too. His face was screwed up in concentration, but only feeble wisps of silver smoke issued from his wand tip. "You got to think of something happy," Harry reminded him. "I'm trying," said Neville miserably. He was trying so hard his round face was actually shining with sweat. "Harry, I think I'm doing it," yelled Seamus, who had been brought along to his first DA meeting by Dean. "Look, it's gone. But it was definitely something, Harry. Harry, it was hairy." Hermione's Patronus, a shining silver otter, was gambolling around her. "They are sort of nice, aren't they?" she said, looking at it fondly. The door of the room of requirement opened and closed. Harry looked around to see who had entered, but there did not seem to be anybody there. It was a few moments before he realised that the people close to the door had fallen silent. Next thing he knew, something was nagging at his robes, somewhere near the knee. He looked down and saw, to his great astonishment, Dobby the house elf peering up at him from beneath his usual 8 woolly hats. "Hi, Dobby," he said. What's wrong?" The elf's eyes were wide with terror, and he was shaking. The members of the DA closest to Harry had fallen silent. Everybody in the room was watching Dobby. The few Patronuses people had managed to conjure faded away into silver mist, leaving the room looking much darker than before. "Harry Potter, sir," squeaked the elf, trembling from head to foot. "Harry Potter, sir. Dobby has come to warn you. But The house elves have been warned not to tell." He ran head first at the wall. Harry, who had some experience of Dobby's habits of self-punishment, made to seize him, but Dobby merely bounced off the stone, cushioned by his 8 hats. Hermione and a few of the other girls let out squeaks of fear and sympathy. "What's happened, Dobby?" Harry asked, grabbing the elf's tiny arm and holding him away from anything with which he might seek to hurt himself. "Harry Potter! She... Dobby hit himself hard on the nose with his free fist. Harry seized that too. "Who's she, Dobby?" But he thought he knew. Surely only one she could induce such fear in Dobby. The elf looked up at him, slightly cross-eyed, and mouthed wordlessly. "Umbridge?" asked Harry, horrified. Dobby nodded, then tried to bang his head on Harry's knees. Harry held him at arm's length. "What about her, Dobby? She hasn't found out about this, about us, about the DA?" He read the answer on the elf-stricken face, his hands held fast by Harry. Dobby tried to kick himself and sank to his knees. "Is she coming?" Harry asked quietly. Dobby let out a howl. "Yes, Harry Potter, yes!" Harry straightened up and looked around at the motionless, terrified people gazing at the thrashing elf. "What are you waiting for?" Harry bellowed. "Run!" They all pelted towards the exit at once, forming a scrum at the door. Then people burst through. Harry could hear them sprinting along the corridors and hoped they had the sense not to try and make it all the way to their dormitories. It was only 10 to 9. If they just took refuge in the library or the owlery, which were both nearer. "Harry, come on!" shrieked Hermione from the centre of the knot of people now fighting to get out. He scooped up Dobby, who was still attempting to do himself serious injury, and ran with the elf in his arms to join the back of the queue. "Dobby, this is an order. Get back to the kitchen with the other elves, and, if she asks you whether you warned me, lie and say no," said Harry. "And I forbid you to hurt yourself," he added, dropping the elf as he made it over the threshold at last and slammed the door behind him. "Thank you, Harry Potter," squeaked Dobby as he streaked off. Harry glanced left and right. The others were all moving as fast as he caught, so fast he caught only glimpses of flying heels at either end of the corridor before they vanished. He started to run, right. There was a boys' bathroom up ahead. He could pretend he'd been in there all the time, if he could just reach it. Ah! Something caught him around the ankles and he fell spectacularly, skidding along on his front for 6 feet before coming to a halt. Someone behind him was laughing. He rolled over onto his back and saw Malfoy concealed in a niche beneath an ugly dragon-shaped vase. "Trip, Jinx, Potter," he said. "Hey, Professor, I've got one." Umbridge came bustling around the far corner, breathless but wearing a delighted smile. "It's him," she said jubilantly, as the sight of Harry on the floor. "Excellent, Draco, excellent. Oh, very good. 50 points to Slytherin. I'll take him from here. Stand up, Potter." Harry got to his feet, glaring at the pair of them. He had never seen Umbridge looking so happy. She seized his arm in a vice-like grip and turned, beaming broadly to Malfoy. "You hop along and see if you can round up any more of them, Draco," she said. "Tell the others to look in the library. Anybody out of breath? Check the bathrooms. Miss Parkinson can do the girls' ones. Off you go. And you," she added in her softest, most dangerous voice, as Malfoy walked away. "You can come with me to the headmaster's office, Potter." They were at the stone gargoyle within minutes. Harry wondered how many of the others had been caught. He thought of Ron. Mrs. Weasley would kill him, and of how Hermione would feel if she was expelled before she took her owls. And it had been Seamus's very first meeting, and Neville had been getting so good. "Fizzing Wisby," said Umbridge. The stone gargoyle jumped aside. The wall behind split open, and they ascended the moving stone staircase. They reached the polished door with a griffin knocker, but Umbridge did not bother to knock. She strode straight inside, still holding tight to Harry. The office was full of people. Dumbledore was sitting behind his desk, his expression serene, the tips of his long fingers together. Professor McGonagall stood rigidly beside him, her face extremely tense. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, was rocking backwards and forwards on his toes beside the fire, apparently immensely pleased with the situation. Kingsley Shacklebolt and a tough-looking wizard with very short wiry hair, whom Harry did not recognise, were positioned either side of the door like guards, and the freckled, bespectacled form of Percy Weasley hovered excitedly beside the wall, a quill and a heavy scroll of parchment in his hands, apparently poised to take notes. The portraits of old headmasters and headmistresses were not shamming sleep tonight. All of them were alert and serious, watching what was happening below them. As Harry entered, a few flitted into neighbouring frames and whispered urgently into their neighbour's ear. Harry pulled himself free of Umbridge's grasp as the door swung shut behind them. Cornelius Fudge was glaring at him with a kind of vicious satisfaction on his face. "Well," he said. "Well, well, well." Harry replied with the dirtiest look he could muster. His heart drummed madly inside him, but his brain was oddly cool and clear. "He was heading back to Gryffindor Tower," said Umbridge. There was an indecent excitement in her voice, the same callous pleasure Harry had heard as she watched Professor Trelawney dissolving with misery in the entrance hall. The Malfoy boy cornered him. "Did he? Did he?" said Fudge appreciatively. "I must remember to tell Lucius. Well, Potter, I expect you know why you are here." Harry fully intended to respond with a defiant yes. His mouth had opened, and the word was half-formed when he caught sight of Dumbledore's face. Dumbledore was not looking directly at Harry. His eyes were fixed on a point just over his shoulder. But as Harry stared at him, he shook his head, a fraction of an inch to each side. Harry changed direction mid-word. No." "I beg your pardon," said Fudge. "No," said Harry firmly. "You don't know why you are here." "No, I don't," said Harry. Fudge looked incredulously from Harry to Professor Umbridge. Harry took advantage of this momentary inattention to steal another quick look at Dumbledore, who gave the carpet the tiniest of nods and the shadow of a wink. "So you have no idea," said Fudge, in a voice positively sagging with sarcasm, "why Professor Umbridge has brought you to this office? You are not aware that you have broken any school rules?" "School rules?" said Harry. "No." "Or ministry decrees," amended Fudge angrily. "Not that I'm aware of," said Harry blandly. His heart was still hammering very fast. It was almost worth telling these lies to watch Fudge's blood pressure rising, but he could not see how on earth he would get away with them. If somebody had tipped off Umbridge about the DA, then he, the leader, might as well be packing his trunk right now. "So it's news to you, is it?" said Fudge, his voice now thick with anger, "that an illegal student organisation has been discovered within this school?" "Yes, it is," said Harry, hoisting an unconvincing look of innocent surprise onto his face. "I think, Minister," said Umbridge silkily from beside him, "we might make better progress if I fetch our informant." Yes, do," said Fudge, nodding, and he glanced maliciously at Dumbledore as Umbridge left the room. "There's nothing like a good witness, is there, Dumbledore?" "Nothing at all, Cornelius," said Dumbledore gravely, inclining his head. There was a wait of several minutes, in which nobody looked at each other. Then Harry heard the door open behind him. Umbridge moved past him into the room, gripping by the shoulder Cho's curly-haired friend Marietta, who was hiding her face in her hands. "Don't be scared, dear. Don't be frightened," said Professor Umbridge softly, patting her on the back. "It's quite all right now. You have done the right thing. The minister is very pleased with you. He'll be telling your mother what a good girl you've been. Marietta's mother, Minister," she added, looking up at Fudge, "is Madam Edgecombe, from the Department of Magical Transportation, Flu Network Office. She's been helping us police the Hogwarts fires. You know." Jolly good, said Fudge heartily. "Like mother, like daughter, eh? Well, come on now, dear, look up. Don't be shy. Let's hear what you've got to... Galloping gargoyles!" As Marietta raised her head, Fudge leapt backwards in shock, nearly landing himself in the fire. He cursed and stamped on the hem of his cloak, which he had started to smoke. Marietta gave a wail and pulled the neck of her robes right up to her eyes, but not before everyone had seen that her face was horribly disfigured by a series of close-set purple pustules that had spread across her nose and cheeks to form the word sneak. "Never mind the spots, dear. Now," said Umbridge impatiently, "just take your robes away from your mouth and tell the minister." But Marietta gave another muffled wail and shook her head frantically. "Oh, very well, you silly girl, I'll tell them," snapped Umbridge. She hitched her sickly smile back onto her face and said, "Well, Minister, Miss Edgecombe here came to my office shortly after dinner this evening and told me she had something she wanted to tell me. She said that if I proceeded to a secret room on the 7th floor, sometimes known as the Room of Requirement, I would find out something to my advantage. I questioned her a little further, and she admitted that there was to be some kind of meeting there. Unfortunately, at that point this hex," she waved impatiently at Marietta's concealed face, "came into operation, and upon catching sight of her face in my mirror, the girl became too distressed to tell me any more." "Well now," said Fudge, fixing Marietta with what he evidently imagined was a kind and fatherly look. "It is very brave of you, my dear, coming to tell Professor Umbridge. You did exactly the right thing. Now, will you tell me what happened at this meeting? What was its purpose? Who was there?" But Marietta would not speak. She merely shook her head again, her eyes wide and fearful. "Haven't we got a counter-jinx for this?" Fudge asked Umbridge impatiently, gesturing at Marietta's face, "so she can speak freely." "I have not yet managed to find one," Umbridge admitted grudgingly, and Harry felt a surge of pride in Hermione's jinxing ability. "But it doesn't matter if she won't speak. I can take up the story from here. You will remember, Minister, that I sent you to report back in October that Potter had met a number of fellow students in the Hog's Head in Hogsmeade. And what is your evidence for that?" cut in Professor McGonagall. "I have testimony from Willie Widdershins Minerva, who happened to be in the bar at the time. He was heavily bandaged, it is true, but his hearing was quite unimpaired," said Umbridge smugly. "He heard every word Potter said and hastened straight to the school to report to me." "Oh, so that's why he wasn't prosecuted for setting up all those regurgitating toilets," said Professor McGonagall, raising her eyebrows. "What an interesting insight into our justice system." "Blatant corruption," roared the portrait of the corpulent, red-nosed wizard on the wall behind Dumbledore's desk. "The Ministry did not cut deals with petty criminals in my day. No, sir, they did not." "Thank you, Fortescue. That will do," said Dumbledore softly. "The purpose of Potter's meeting with these students," continued Professor Umbridge, "was to persuade them to join an illegal society whose aim was to learn spells and curses the Ministry had decided are inappropriate for school age." "I think you'll find you're wrong there, Dolores," said Dumbledore quietly, peering at her over the half-moon spectacles perched halfway down his crooked nose. Harry stared at him. He could not see how Dumbledore was going to talk him out of this one. If Willie Windershins had indeed heard every word he had said in the Hog's Head, there was simply no escaping it. "Oh-ho," said Fudge, bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet again. "Yes, do let's hear the latest cock and bull story designed to pull Potter out of trouble. Go on then, Dumbledore, go on. Willie Windershins was lying, was he? Or was it Potter's identical twin in the Hog's Head that day? Or is there the usual simple explanation involving a reversal of time, a dead man coming back to life, and a couple of invisible Dementors?" Percy Weasley let out a hearty laugh. "Oh, very good, Minister, very good." Harry could have kicked him. Then he saw to his astonishment that Dumbledore was smiling gently too. "Cornelius, I do not deny, and nor, I am sure, does Harry, that he was in the Hog's Head that day, nor that he was trying to recruit students to a defense against the Dark Arts group. I am merely pointing out that Dolores is quite wrong to suggest that such a group was, at that time, illegal. If you remember, the Ministry decree banning all student societies was not put into effect until 2 days after Harry's Hogsmeade meeting, so he was not breaking any rules at all in the Hog's Head." Percy looked as though he'd been struck in the face by something very heavy. Fudge remained motionless in mid-bounce, his mouth hanging open. Umbridge recovered first. "That's very fine, Headmaster," she said, smiling sweetly. "But we are now nearly 6 months on from the introduction of Educational Decree number 24. If the first meeting was not illegal, all those that have happened since most certainly are." "Well," said Dumbledore, surveying her with polite interest over the top of his interlocked fingers, "they certainly would be, if they had continued after the decree came into effect. Do you have any evidence that any such meetings continued?" As Dumbledore spoke, Harry heard a rustle behind him, and rather thought Kingsley whispered something. He could have sworn, too, that he felt something brush against his side, a gentle something, like a draught or bird's wings, but looking down he saw nothing there. "Evidence?" repeated Umbridge, with that horrible wide toad-like smile. "Have you not been listening, Dumbledore? Why do you think Miss Edgecombe is here?" "Oh, can she tell us about 6 months' worth of meetings?" said Dumbledore, raising his eyebrows. "I was under the impression that she was merely reporting a meeting tonight." "Miss Edgecombe," said Umbridge at once, "tell us how long these meetings have been going on, dear. You can simply nod or shake your head. I'm sure that won't make your spots worse. Have they been happening regularly over the last 6 months?" Harry felt a horrible plummeting in his stomach. This was it. They had hit a dead end of solid evidence that not even Dumbledore would be able to shift aside. "Just nod or shake your head, dear," Umbridge said coaxingly to Marietta. "Come on now. That won't reactivate the jinx." Everyone in the room was gazing at the top of Marietta's face. Only her eyes were visible between the pulled-up robes and her curly fringe. Perhaps it was a trick of the firelight, but her eyes looked oddly blank. And then, to Harry's utter amazement, Marietta shook her head. Umbridge looked quickly at Fudge, then back at Marietta. I don't think you understood the question, dear. Did you? I'm asking whether you have been going to these meetings for the past 6 months. You have, haven't you?" Again, Marietta shook her head. "What do you mean by shaking your head, dear?" said Umbridge in a testy voice. "I would have thought her meaning was quite clear," said Professor McGonagall harshly. "There have been no secret meetings for the past 6 months. Is that correct, Miss Edgecombe?" Marietta nodded. "But there was a meeting tonight," said Umbridge furiously. "There was a meeting, Miss Edgecombe. You told me about it. In the room of requirement, and Potter was the leader. Was he not? Potter organised it. Potter, why are you shaking your head, girl?" "Well, usually when a person shakes their head," said McGonagall coldly, "they mean no. So unless Miss Edgecombe is using a form of sign language as yet unknown to humans..." Professor Umbridge seized Marietta, pulled her round to face her, and began shaking her very hard. A split second later, Dumbledore was on his feet, his wand raised. Kingsley started forwards, and Umbridge leapt back from Marietta, waving her hands in the air as though they had been burned. "I cannot allow you to manhandle my students, Dolores," said Dumbledore, and for the first time he looked angry. "You want to calm yourself, Madam Umbridge," said Kingsley in his deep, low voice. "You don't want to get yourself into trouble now." "No," said Umbridge breathlessly, glancing up at the towering figure of Kingsley. Yes, you're right, Shacklebolt. I forgot myself." Marietta was standing exactly where Umbridge had released her. She seemed rather perturbed by Umbridge's sudden attack, nor relieved by her release. She was still clutching her robe up to her oddly blank eyes and staring straight ahead of her. A sudden suspicion, concocted and connected to Kingsley's whisper, and the thing he had felt shoot past him, sprang into Harry's mind. "Dolores," said Fudge, with the air of trying to settle something once and for all, "the meeting tonight, the one we know definitely happened." "Yes," said Umbridge, pulling herself together. "Yes, well, Miss Edgecombe tipped me off, and I proceeded at once to the 7th floor, accompanied by certain trustworthy students, so as to catch those in the meeting red-handed. It appears that they were forewarned of my arrival, however, because when we reached the 7th floor, they were running in every direction. It does not matter, however. I have all their names here. Miss Parkinson ran into the room of requirement for me to see if they had left anything behind. We needed evidence, and the room provided." and to Harry's horror she withdrew from her pocket the list of names that had been pinned upon the Room of Requirements wall and handed it to Fudge. "The moment I saw Potter's name on the list, I knew what we were dealing with," she said softly. "Excellent," said Fudge, a smile spreading across his face. "Excellent, Dolores. And, by thunder!" He looked up at Dumbledore, who was still standing beside Marietta, his wand held loosely in his hand. "See what they've named themselves," said Fudge quietly. "Dumbledore's Army." Dumbledore reached out and took the piece of parchment from Fudge. He gazed at the heading scribbled by Hermione months before, and for a moment seemed unable to speak. Then he looked up, smiling. "Well, the game is up," he said simply. "Would you like a written confession from me, Cornelius? Or will a statement before these witnesses suffice?" Harry saw McGonagall and Kingsley look at each other. There were fear in both faces. He did not understand what was going on, and nor apparently did Fudge. "Statement?" said Fudge slowly. "What? I didn't—" "Dumbledore's Army, Cornelius," said Dumbledore, still smiling, as he waved the list of names before Fudge's face. "Not Potter's Army. Dumbledore's Army." But... Understanding blazed suddenly in Fudge's face. He took a horrified step backwards, yelped, and jumped out of the fire again. "You!" he whispered, stamping again on his smouldering cloak. "That's right," said Dumbledore pleasantly. "You organised this?" "I did," said Dumbledore. "You recruited these students for your army?" "Tonight was supposed to be the first meeting," said Dumbledore, nodding, "merely to see whether they would be interested in joining me. I see now that it was a mistake to invite Miss Edgecombe, of course." Marietta nodded. Fudge looked from her to Dumbledore, his chest swelling. "Then you have been plotting against me," he yelled. "That's right," said Dumbledore cheerfully. "No!" shouted Harry. Kingsley flashed a look of warning at him. McGonagall widened her eyes threateningly. But it had suddenly dawned on Harry what Dumbledore was about to do, and he could not let it happen. "No, Professor Dumbledore!" "Be quiet, Harry, or I'm afraid you will have to leave my office," said Dumbledore calmly. "You shut up, Potter," barked Fudge, who was still ogling Dumbledore with a kind of horrified delight. Well, I came here tonight suspecting and expecting to expel Potter, and instead, you get to arrest me," said Dumbledore, smiling. "It's like losing a nut and finding a galleon, isn't it?" "Weasley!" cried Fudge, now positively quivering with delight. "Weasley, have you written it all down? Everything he said, his confession. Have you got it?" "Yes, sir. I think so, sir," said Percy eagerly, whose nose was splattered with ink from the speed of his note-taking. "The bit about how he's been trying to build up an army against the Ministry, how he's been working to destabilise me?" "Yes, sir. I've got it, yes," said Percy, scanning his notes joyfully. "Very well, then," said Fudge, now radiant with glee. "Duplicate your notes, Weasley, and send a copy to the Daily Prophet at once. If we send at first a fast owl, we should make the morning edition." Percy dashed from the room, slamming the door behind him, and Fudge turned back to Dumbledore. "You will now be escorted back to the Ministry, where you will be formally charged, then sent to Azkaban to await trial." "Ah," said Dumbledore gently. Yes. I thought we might hit that little snag." "Snag?" said Fudge, his voice still vibrating with joy. "I see no snag, Dumbledore." "Well," said Dumbledore apologetically, "I'm afraid I do." "Oh, really?" "Well, it's just that you seem to be labouring under the delusion that I am going to, what is the phrase, come quietly. I'm afraid I am not going to come quietly at all, Cornelius. I have absolutely no intention of being sent to Azkaban. I could break out, of course, but what a waste of time. And frankly, I can think of a whole host of things I would rather be doing." Umbridge's face was growing steadily redder. She looked as though she was being filled with boiling water. Fudge stared at Dumbledore with a very silly expression on his face, as though he had just been stunned by a sudden blow and could not quite believe it had happened. He made a small choking noise, then looked round at Kingsley and the man with short grey hair, who alone of everyone in the room had remained entirely silent so far. The latter gave Fudge a reassuring nod and moved forwards a little, away from the wall. Harry saw his hand drift almost casually towards his pocket. "Don't be silly, Dawlish," said Dumbledore kindly. "I'm sure you're an excellent aura. I seem to remember that you achieved outstanding in all your newts, but if you attempt to, bring me in by force, I will have to hurt you." The man called Dawlish blinked rather foolishly. He looked towards Fudge again, but this time seemed to be hoping for a clue as to what to do next. "So," sneered Fudge, recovering himself, "you intend to take on Dawlish, Shacklebolt, Dolores and myself single-handed, do you, Dumbledore?" "Merlin's bid, no," said Dumbledore, smiling. "Not unless you are foolish enough to force me to." He will not be single-handed," said Professor McGonagall loudly, plunging her hand inside her robes. "Oh, yes, he will, Minerva," said Dumbledore sharply. "Hogwarts needs you." "Enough of this rubbish," said Fudge, pulling out his own wand. "Dawlish, Shacklebolt, take him!" A streak of silver light flashed around the room. There was a bang, like a gunshot, and the floor trembled. A hand grabbed the scruff of Harry's neck and forced him down onto the floor as a second silver flash went off. Several of the portraits yelled, Fawkes screeched, and a cloud of dust filled the air. Coughing in the dust, Harry saw a dark figure fall to the ground with a crash in front of him. There was a shriek and a thud, and somebody cried, "No!" Then there was the sound of breaking glass, frantically scuffling footsteps, a groan and silence. Harry struggled around to see who was half strangling him and saw Professor McGonagall crouched beside him. She had forced both him and Marietta out of harm's way. Dust was still floating gently down through the air onto them. Panting slightly, Harry saw a very tall figure moving towards them. "Are you all right?" Dumbledore asked. "Yes," said Professor McGonagall, getting up and dragging Harry and Marietta with her. The dust was clearing. The wreckage of the office loomed into view. Dumbledore's desk had been overturned. All of the spindly tables had been knocked onto the floor, their silver instruments in pieces. Fudge, Umbridge, Kingsley and Dawlish lay motionless on the floor. Fawkes, the phoenix, soared in wide circles above them, singing softly. "Unfortunately, I had to hex Kingsley too, or it would have looked very suspicious," said Dumbledore in a low voice. "He was remarkably quick on the uptake, modifying Miss Edgecombe's memory like that while everyone was looking the other way. Thank him for me, won't you, Minerva? Now, they will all awake very soon, and it will be best if they do not know that we had time to communicate. You must act as though no time has passed, as though they were merely knocked to the ground. They will not remember." "Where will you go, Dumbledore?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Grimmauld Place?" "Oh no," said Dumbledore with a grim smile. "I'm not leaving to go into hiding. Fudge will soon wish he'd never dislodged me from Hogwarts, I promise you." "Professor Dumbledore," Harry began. He did not know what to say first. How sorry he was that he had started the DA in the first place and caused all this trouble, or how terrible he felt that Dumbledore was leaving to save him from expulsion. But Dumbledore cut him off before he could say another word. "Listen to me, Harry," he said urgently. "You must study occlumency as hard as you can. Do you understand me? Do everything Professor Snape tells you and practice it particularly every night before sleeping so that you can close your mind to bad dreams. You will understand very soon enough, but you must promise me." The man called Dawlish was stirring. Dumbledore seized Harry's wrist. "Remember, close your mind." But as Dumbledore's fingers closed over Harry's skin, a pain shot through the scar on his forehead, and he felt again that terrible snake-like longing to strike Dumbledore, to bite him, to hurt him. "You will understand," whispered Dumbledore. Fawkes circled the office and swooped low over him. Dumbledore released Harry, raised his hand and grasped the phoenix's long golden tail. There was a flash of fire, and the pair of them were gone. "Where is he?" yelled Fudge, pushing himself up from the floor. "Where is he?" "I don't know," shouted Kingsley, also leaping to his feet. "Well, he can't have disappeared or disapparated," cried Umbridge. "You can't do it from inside this school." "The stairs!" cried Dawlish, and he flung himself up to the door, wrenched it open and disappeared. followed closely by Kingsley and Umbridge. Fudge hesitated, then got slowly to his feet, brushing dust from his front. There was a long and painful silence. "Well, Minerva," said Fudge nastily, straightening his torn shirt sleeve, "I'm afraid this is the end of your friend Dumbledore." "You think so, do you?" said Professor McGonagall scornfully. Fudge seemed not to hear her. He was looking around at the wrecked office. A few of the portraits hissed at him. One or two even made rude hand gestures. "You'd better get those two off to bed," said Fudge, looking back at Professor McGonagall with a dismissive nod towards Harry and Marietta. Professor McGonagall said nothing, but marched Harry and Marietta to the door, and it swung closed behind them. Harry heard Phineas Nicholas's voice. "You know, Minister, I disagree with Dumbledore on many counts, but you cannot deny he's got style." Chapter 28. Snape's Worst Memory. By order of the Ministry of Magic, Dolores Jane Umbridge, High Inquisitor, has replaced Albus Dumbledore as head of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The above is in accordance with Educational Decree No. 28, signed Cornelius Oswald Fudge, Minister for Magic. The notices had gone up all around the school overnight, but they did not explain how every single person within the castle seemed to know that Dumbledore had overcome two auras, the High Inquisitor, the Minister for Magic, and his junior assistant, to escape. No matter where Harry went within the castle, the sole topic of conversation was Dumbledore's flight, and though some of the details may have gone awry in the retelling, Harry overheard one second-year girl assuring another that Fudge was now lying in St. Mungo's with a pumpkin for a head. It was surprising how accurate the rest of their information was. Everybody knew, for instance, that Harry and Marietta were the only students to have witnessed the scene in Dumbledore's office, and, as Marietta was now in the hospital wing, Harry found himself besieged with requests to give a first-hand account. "Dumbledore will be back before long," said Ernie Macmillan, confidently on the way back from herbology, after listening intently to Harry's story. "They couldn't keep him away in our second year, and they won't be able to this time. The Fat Friar told me." He dropped his voice conspiratorially, so that Harry, Ron and Hermione had to lean closer to hear him. "That Umbridge tried to get back into his office last night after they'd searched the castle and grounds for him. Couldn't get past the gargoyle. The head's office has sealed itself against her," Ernie smirked. "Apparently, she had a right little tantrum." "Oh, I expect she really fancied herself sitting up there in the head's office," said Hermione viciously, as they walked up the stone steps into the entrance hall, lording it all over all the other teachers, the stupid, puffed-up, power-crazy old... "Now, do you really want to finish that sentence, Granger?" Draco Malfoy had slid out from behind the door, followed by Crabbe and Goyle. His pale, pointed face was alight with malice. "Afraid I'm going to have to dock a few points from Gryffindor and Hufflepuff," he drawled. "You can't take points from fellow prefects, Malfoy," said Ernie at once. "I know prefects can't dock points from each other," sneered Malfoy. Crabbe and Goyle sniggered. "But members of the Inquisitorial Squad—" "The what?" said Hermione sharply. "The Inquisitorial Squad, Granger," said Malfoy, pointing towards a tiny silver eye on his robes, just beneath his prefect's badge. "A select group of students who are supportive of the Ministry of Magic, hand-picked by Professor Umbridge. Anyway, members of the Inquisitorial Squad do have the power to dock points. So, Granger, I'll have 5 from you for being rude about our new headmistress. Macmillan, 5 for contradicting me. 5 because I don't like you, Potter. Weasley, your shirt's untucked, so I'll have another 5 for that. Oh yeah, I forgot. You're a mudblood, Granger, so 10 off for that." Ron pulled out his wand, but Hermione pushed it away, whispering, "Don't." "Wise move, Granger," breathed Malfoy. "New head, new times. Be good now, Potty, Weasel King." Laughing heartily, he strode away with Crabbe and Goyle. "He was bluffing," said Ernie, looking appalled. "He can't be allowed to dock points. That would be ridiculous. It would completely undermine the prefect system." But Harry, Ron and Hermione had turned automatically towards the giant hourglasses set in niches along the wall behind them, which recorded the house points. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw had been neck and neck in the lead that morning. Even as they watched, stones flew upwards, reducing the amounts in the lower bulbs. In fact, the only glass that seemed unchanged was the emerald-filled one of Slytherin. "Noticed, have you?" said Fred's voice. He and George had just come down the marble staircase and joined Harry, Ron, Hermione and Ernie in front of the hourglasses. "Malfoy just docked us all about 50 points, said Harry furiously, as they watched several more stones fly upwards from the Gryffindor hourglass. "Yeah, Montague tried to do us during breaks," said George. "What do you mean, tried?" said Ron quickly. "He never managed to get all the words out," said Fred, "due to the fact that we forced him head first into the vanishing cabinet on the first floor." Hermione looked very shocked. "But you'll get into terrible trouble." "Not until Montague reappears, and that could take weeks. I don't know where we sent him," said Fred coolly. "Anyway, we've decided we don't care about getting into trouble anymore." "Have you ever?" asked Hermione. "Course we have," said George. "Never been expelled, have we?" "We've always known where to draw the line," said Fred. "We might have put a toe across it occasionally," said George. "But we've always stopped short of causing real mayhem," said Fred. "But now," said Ron tentatively. "Well now," said George. "What with Dumbledore gone," said Fred. "We reckon a bit of mayhem," said George, "is exactly what our dear new head deserves," said Fred. "You mustn't," whispered Hermione. "You really mustn't. She'd love a reason to expel you." "You don't get it, Hermione, do you?" said Fred, smiling at her. "We don't care about staying any more. We'd walk out right now if we weren't determined to do our bit for Dumbledore first. So anyway," he checked his watch, "Phase 1 is about to begin. I'd get in the Great Hall for lunch if I were you. The way the teachers will see you can't have had anything to do with it." "Anything to do with what?" said Hermione anxiously. "You'll see," said George. "Run along now." Fred and George turned away and disappeared into the swelling crowd, descending the stairs towards lunch. Looking highly disconcerted, Ernie muttered something about unfinished Transfiguration homework and scurried away. "I think we should get out of here, you know," said Hermione nervously. "Just in case." "Yeah, all right," said Ron, and the three of them moved towards the door to the Great Hall. But Harry had barely glimpsed the day's ceiling of scudding white clouds when somebody tapped him on the shoulder and turned. He found himself against almost nose to nose with Filch, the caretaker. He took several hasty steps backwards. Filch was best viewed at a distance. "The headmistress would like to see you, Potter," he leered. "I didn't do it," said Harry stupidly, thinking of whatever Fred and George were planning. Filch's jowls wobbled with silent laughter. "Guilty conscience, eh?" he wheezed. "Follow me." Harry glanced back at Ron and Hermione, who were both looking worried. He shrugged and followed Filch back into the entrance hall, against the tide of hungry students. Filch seemed to be in an extremely good mood. He hummed creakily under his breath as they climbed the marble staircase. As they reached the first landing, he said, "Things are changing around here, Potter." "I've noticed," said Harry coldly. "Yes, I've been telling Dumbledore for years and years he's too soft with you all," said Filch, chuckling nastily. "You filthy little beasts would never have dropped stink pellets if you'd known I had it in my power to whip you raw, would you? Now, nobody would have thought of throwing fanged frisbees down the corridors if I could have strung you up by the ankles in my office, would they? But when Educational Decree number 29 comes in, Potter, I'll be allowed to do them things. And she's asked the minister to sign in order for the expulsion of Peeves. Oh, things are going to be very different around here with her in charge." Umbridge had obviously gone to some lengths to get Filch on her side, Harry thought, and the worst of it was that he would probably prove an important weapon. His knowledge of the school's secret passageways and hiding places was probably second only to that of the Weasley twins. "Here we are," he said, leering down at Harry as he rapped 3 times on Professor Umbridge's door and pushed it open. "The Potter boy to see you, ma'am." Umbridge's office, so very familiar to Harry from his many detentions, was the same as usual except for the large wooden block lying across the front of her desk, on which golden letters spelled the word Headmistress. Also, his firebolt and Fred and George's clean sweeps, which he saw with a pang, were chained and padlocked to a stout iron peg in the wall behind the desk. Umbridge was sitting behind the desk, busily scribbling on some of her pink parchment, but she looked up and smiled wildly at the entrance. "Thank you, Argus," she said sweetly. "Not at all, ma'am, not at all," said Filch, bowing as low as his rheumatism would permit, and exiting backwards. "Sit," said Umbridge curtly, pointing towards a chair. Harry sat. She continued to scribble for a few moments. He watched some of the foul kittens gambolling around the plates over her head, wondering what fresh horror she had in store for him. "Well now," she said finally, setting down her quill and looking like a toad about to swallow a particularly juicy fly. "What would you like to drink?" "What?" said Harry, quite sure he had misheard her. "To drink, Mr. Potter," she said, smiling still more widely. "Tea, coffee, pumpkin juice?" As she named each drink, she gave her short wand a wave, and a cup or glass of it appeared on her desk. Nothing, thank you," said Harry. "I wish you to have a drink with me," she said, her voice becoming dangerously sweet. "Choose one." Fine, tea then," said Harry, shrugging. She got up and made quite a performance of adding milk with her back to him. She then bustled around the desk with it, smiling in a sinisterly sweet fashion. "There," she said, handing it to him. "Drink it before it gets cold, won't you? Well now, Mr. Potter, I thought we ought to have a little chat after the distressing events of last night." He said nothing. She settled herself back into her seat and waited. When several long moments had passed in silence, she said gaily, "You're not drinking up?" He raised the cup to his lips and then, just as suddenly, lowered it. One of the horrible painted kittens behind Umbridge had great round blue eyes, just like Mad-Eyed Moody's magical one, and it had just occurred to Harry what Mad-Eye would say if he ever heard that Harry had drunk anything offered by a known enemy. "What's the matter?" said Umbridge, who was still watching him. Do you want some sugar?" "No," said Harry. He raised the cup to his lips again and pretended to take a sip, though keeping his mouth tightly closed. Umbridge's smile widened. "Good," she whispered. "Very good. Now then." She leaned forwards a little. "Where is Albus Dumbledore?" "No idea," said Harry promptly. Drink up," she said, still smiling. "Now, Mr. Potter, let us not play childish games. I know that you know where he has gone. You and Dumbledore have been in this together from the beginning. Consider your position, Mr. Potter." I don't know where he is." Harry pretended to drink again. "Very well," said Umbridge, looking displeased. "In that case, you will kindly tell me the whereabouts of Sirius Black." Harry's stomach turned over, and his hand holding the teacup shook so it rattled in its saucer. He tilted the cup to his mouth, with his lips pressed together, so that some of the hot liquid trickled down onto his robes. "I don't know," he said, a little too quickly. "Mr. Potter," said Umbridge, let me remind you that it was I who almost caught the criminal Black in the Gryffindor fire in October. I know perfectly well it was you who he was meeting, and if I had my proof, neither of you would be at large today. I promise you, I repeat, Mr. Potter, where is Sirius Black?" "No idea," said Harry loudly. "Haven't got a clue." They stared at each other so long that Harry felt his eyes watering. Then Umbridge stood up. "Very well, Potter. I will take your word for it this time, but be warned. The might of the Ministry stands behind me. All channels of communication in and out of this school are being monitored. A Flu Network regulator is keeping watch over every fire in Hogwarts, except my own, of course. My inquisitorial squad is opening and reading all Owl Post, entering and leaving the castle, and Mr. Filch is observing all secret passages in and out of the castle. If I find a shred of evidence—" Boom! The very floor of the office shook. Umbridge slipped sideways, clutching her desk for support, and looking shocked. "What was—" She was gazing towards the door. Harry took the opportunity to empty his almost full cup of tea into the nearest vase of dried flowers. He could hear people running and screaming several floors below. "Back to lunch you go, Potter," said Umbridge, raising her wand and dashing out of the office. Harry gave her a few seconds' start and then hurried after her to see what the source of all the uproar was. It was not difficult to find. 1 floor down, pandemonium reigned. Somebody, and Harry had a very shrewd idea who, had set off what seemed to be an enormous crate of enchanted fireworks. Dragons comprised entirely of green and gold sparks were soaring up and down the corridors, emitting loud, fiery blasts and bangs as they went. Shocking pink Catherine wheels, 5 feet in diameter, were whizzing lethally through the air like so many flying saucers. Rockets with long tails of brilliant silver stars were ricocheting off the walls. Sparklers were writing swear words in mid-air of their own accord. Firecrackers were exploding like mines everywhere. Harry looked, and instead of burning themselves out, fading from sight or sizzling to a halt. These pyrotechnical miracles seemed to be gaining in energy and momentum the longer he watched. Filch and Umbridge were standing, apparently transfixed in horror, halfway down the stairs. As Harry watched, one of the large Catherine wheels seemed to decide that what it needed was more room to manoeuvre. It whirled towards Umbridge and Filch with a sinister whee! They both yelled with fright and ducked, and it soared straight out of the window behind them and off across the grounds. Meanwhile, several of the dragons and a large purple bat that was smoking ominously took advantage of the open door at the end of the corridor to escape towards the second floor. "Hurry, Filch, hurry!" shrieked Umbridge. They'll be all over the school unless we do something. Stupefy! A jet of red light shot out of the end of her wand and hit one of the rockets. Instead of freezing in mid-air, it exploded with such force that it blasted a hole in a painting of a soppy-looking witch in the middle of a meadow. She ran for it just in time, reappearing seconds later squashed in the next painting, where a couple of wizards playing cards stood up hastily to make room for her. "Don't stun them, Filch!" shouted Umbridge angrily, for all the world as though it had been his incantation. "Right you are, headmistress," wheezed Filch, who, as a squib, could no more have stunned the fireworks than swallowed them. He dashed to a nearby cupboard, pulling out a broom, and began swatting at the fireworks in mid-air. Within seconds, the head of the broom was ablaze. Harry had seen enough. Laughing, he ducked down low, ran to a door he knew was concealed behind a tapestry a little way along the corridor, and slipped through it to find Fred and George hiding just behind it, listening to Umbridge and Filch's yells, and quaking with suppressed mirth. "Impressive," Harry said quietly, grinning. "Very impressive. You'll put Dr. Filibuster out of business, no problem." "Cheers," whispered George, wiping tears of laughter from his face. "Oh, I hope she tries vanishing them next. They multiply by 10 every time you try." The fireworks continued to burn and to spread all over the school that afternoon. Though they caused plenty of disruption, particularly the firecrackers, the other teachers didn't seem to mind them very much. "Dear, dear," said Professor McGonagall sardonically, as one of the dragons soared around her classroom, emitting loud bangs and exhaling flame. "Miss Brown, would you mind running along to the headmistress and informing her that we have an escaped firework in our classroom?" The upshot of it all was that Professor Umbridge spent her first afternoon as headmistress running all over the school answering the summonses of the other teachers, none of whom seemed able to rid their rooms of the fireworks without her. When the final bell rang and they were heading back to Gryffindor Tower with their bags, Harry saw with immense satisfaction a dishevelled and soot-blackened Umbridge tottering sweaty-faced from Professor Flitwick's classroom. "Thank you so much, Professor," said Professor Flitwick in his squeaky little voice. "I could have got rid of the sparklers myself, of course, but I wasn't sure whether or not I had the authority." Beaming, he closed his classroom door in her snarling face. Fred and George were heroes that night in the Gryffindor common room. Even Hermione fought her way through the excited crowd to congratulate them. "They were wonderful fireworks," she said admiringly. "Thanks," said George, looking both surprised and pleased. "Weasley's wildfire whiz-bangs. Only thing is, we used our whole stock. We're going to have to start again from scratch now." "It was worth it, though," said Fred, who was taking orders from clamouring Gryffindors. "If you want to add your name to the waiting list, Hermione, it's 5 galleons for your basic blaze box and 20 for the deflagration deluxe." Hermione returned to the table where Harry and Ron were sitting staring at their school bags as though hoping their homework would spring out and start doing it itself. "Oh, why don't we have a night off?" said Hermione brightly as a silver-tailed Weasley rocket zoomed past the window. "After all, the Easter holidays they start on Friday. We'll have plenty of time then." "Are you feeling all right?" Ron asked, staring at her in disbelief. "Now you mention it," said Hermione happily. "Do you know, I think I'm feeling a bit rebellious." Harry could still hear the distant bangs of escaped firecrackers when he and Ron went up to bed an hour later, and as he got undressed, a sparkler floated past the tower, still resolutely spelling out the word poo. He got into bed, yawning. With his glasses off, the occasional firework passing the window had become blurred, looking like sparkling clouds, beautiful and mysterious against the black sky. He turned onto his side, wondering how Umbridge was feeling about her first day in Dumbledore's job, and how Fudge would react when he heard that the school had spent most of the day in a state of advanced disruption. Smiling to himself, Harry closed his eyes. The whizzes and bangs of escaped fireworks in the grounds seemed to be growing more distant, or perhaps they were simply speeding away for them. He had fallen right into the corridor leading to the Department of Mysteries. He was speeding towards the plain back door. Let it open. Let it open. It did. He was inside the circular room lined with doors. He crossed it, placed his hand on the identical door, and it swung inwards. Now he was in a long, rectangular room, full of an odd mechanical clicking. There were dancing flecks of light on the walls, but he did not pause to investigate. He had to go on. There was a door at the far end. It, too, opened at his touch. And now he was in a dimly lit room, as high and wide as a church, full of nothing but rows and rows of towering shelves, each laden with small, dusty, spun glass spheres. Now Harry's heart was beating fast with excitement. He knew where to go. He ran forwards, but his footsteps made no noise in the enormous, deserted room. There was something in this room he wanted very, very much. Something he wanted, or somebody else wanted. His scar was hurting. Bang! Harry awoke instantly, confused and angry. The dark dormitory was full of the sound of laughter. "Cool," said Seamus, who was silhouetted against the window. "I think one of those Catherine wheels hit a rocket. It's like they mated. Come and see." Harry heard Ron and Dean scramble out of bed for a better look. He lay quite still and silent while the pain in his scar subsided and disappointment washed over him. He felt as though a wonderful treat had been snatched from him at the very last moment. He had got so close to that time. Glittering pink and silver winged piglets were now soaring past the windows of Gryffindor Tower. Harry lay and listened to the appreciative whoops of Gryffindors in the dormitories below them. His stomach gave a sickening jolt as he remembered that he had occlumency the following evening. Harry spent the whole of the next day dreading what Snape was going to say if he found out how much further into the Department of Mysteries Harry had penetrated during his last dream. With a surge of guilt, he realised that he had not practised occlumency once since their last lesson. There had been too much going on since Dumbledore had left. He was sure he would not have been able to empty his mind even if he had tried. He doubted, however, whether Snape would accept that excuse. He attempted a little last-minute practice during classes that day, but it was no good. Hermione kept asking him what was wrong whenever he fell silent, trying to rid himself of all thought and emotion. And after all, the best moment to empty his brain was not while teachers were firing revision questions at the class. Resigned to the worst, he set off for Snape's office after dinner. Halfway across the entrance hall, however, Cho came hurrying up to him. "Over here," said Harry, glad of a reason to postpone his meeting with Snape, and beckoning her across to the corner of the entrance hall where the giant hourglasses stood. Gryffindor's was now almost empty. "Are you okay? Umbridge hasn't been asking you about the DA, has she?" "Oh, no," said Cho hurriedly. "No, it was only... Well, I just wanted to say, Harry, I never dreamed Marietta would tell." "Yeah, well," said Harry moodily. He did feel Cho might have chosen her friends a bit more carefully. It was small consolation that the last he had heard, Marietta was still in the hospital wing, and Madame Pomfrey had not been able to make the slightest improvement to her pimples. "She's a lovely person, really," said Cho. "She just made a mistake." Harry looked at her incredulously. A lovely person who made a mistake. She sold us all out, including you." "Well, we all got away, didn't we?" said Cho pleadingly. "You know, her mum works for the ministry. It's really difficult for her." "Ron's dad works for the ministry too," Harry said furiously. "And in case you hadn't noticed, he hasn't got sneak written across his face." "That was a really horrible trick of Hermione Granger's," said Cho fiercely. "She should have told us she'd jinxed that list." "I think it was a brilliant idea," said Harry coldly. Cho flushed and her eyes grew brighter. "Oh yes, I forgot, of course. It was darling Hermione's idea." "Don't start crying again," said Harry warningly. "I wasn't going to," she shouted. "Yeah, well, good," he said. "I've got enough to cope with at the moment." "Go and cope with it then," Cho said furiously, turning on her heel and stalking off. Fuming, Harry descended the stairs to Snape's dungeon, and though he knew from experience how much easier it would be for Snape to penetrate his mind if he arrived angry and resentful, he succeeded in nothing but thinking of a few more things he should have said to Cho about Marietta before reaching the dungeon door. "You're late, Potter," said Snape coldly, as Harry closed the door behind him. Snape was standing with his back to Harry, removing, as usual, certain of his thoughts and placing them carefully in Dumbledore's pensieve. He dropped the last silvery strand into the stone basin and turned to face Harry. "So," he said, "have you been, practicing?" "Yes," Harry lied, looking carefully at one of the legs of Snape's desk. "Well, we'll soon find out, won't we?" said Snape smoothly. "Wand out, Potter." Harry moved into his usual position, facing Snape with the desk between them. His heart was pumping fast with anger at Cho, and anxiety about how much Snape was about to extract from his mind. "On the count of 3, then," said Snape lazily. 1, 2... Snape's office door banged open and Draco Malfoy sped in. "Professor Snape, sir." Oh, sorry." Malfoy was looking at Snape and Harry in some surprise. "It's all right, Draco," said Snape, lowering his wand. "Potter is here for a little remedial potions." Harry had not seen Malfoy look so gleeful since Umbridge had turned up to inspect Hagrid. "I didn't know," he said, leering at Harry, who knew his face was burning. He would have given a great deal to be able to shout the truth at Malfoy, or even better, to hit him with a good curse. "Well, Draco, what is it?" asked Snape. "It's Professor Umbridge, sir. She needs your help," said Malfoy. "They've found Montague, sir. He's turned up jammed inside a toilet on the 4th floor. "How did he get in there?" demanded Snape. "I don't know, sir. He's a bit confused." Very well, Potter," said Snape. "We shall resume this lesson tomorrow evening." He turned and swept from his office. Malfoy mouthed remedial potions at Harry behind Snape's back before following him. Seething, Harry replaced his wand inside his robes and made to leave the room. At least he had 24 more hours in which to practice. He knew he ought to feel grateful for the narrow escape, though it was hard that it came at the expense of Malfoy telling the whole school that he needed remedial potions. He was at the office door when he saw it, a patch of shivering light dancing on the door frame. He stopped and stood looking at it, reminded of something. Then he remembered. It was a little like the lights he had seen in the dream last night, the lights in the second room he had walked through on his journey through the Department of Mysteries. He turned around. The light was coming from the pensieve, sitting on Snape's desk. The silver-white contents were ebbing and swirling within. Snape's thoughts. Things he did not want Harry to see if he broke through Snape's defences accidentally. Harry gazed at the pensieve, curiosity welling inside him. What was it that Snape was so keen to hide from Harry? The silvery lights shivered on the wall. Harry took 2 steps towards the desk, thinking hard. Could it possibly be information about the Department of Mysteries that Snape was determined to keep from him? Harry looked over his shoulder, his heart now pumping harder and faster than ever. How long would it take Snape to release Montague from the toilet? Would he come straight back to his office afterwards, or accompany Montague to the hospital wing? Surely the latter. Montague was captain of the Slytherin Quidditch team. Snape would want to make sure he was all right. Harry walked the remaining few feet to the pensieve and stood over it, gazing into its depths. He hesitated, listening, then pulled out his wand again. The office and the corridor beyond were completely silent. He gave the contents of the pensieve a small prod with the end of his wand. The silvery stuff within began to swirl very fast. Harry leaned forwards over it and saw that it had become transparent. He was once again looking down into a room, as though through a circular window in the ceiling. In fact, unless he was much mistaken, he was looking down into the great hall. His breath was actually fogging the surface of Snape's thoughts. His brain seemed to be in limbo. It would be insane to do the thing he was so strongly tempted to do. He was trembling. Snape could be back at any moment. But Harry thought of Cho's anger, of Malfoy's jeering face, and a reckless daring seized him. He took a great gulp of breath and plunged his face into the surface of Snape's thoughts. At once, the floor of the office lurched, tipping Harry head first into the pensieve. He was falling through cold blackness, spinning furiously as he went, and then he was standing in the middle of the great hall. But the 4 house tables were gone. Instead, there were more than 100 smaller tables, all facing the same way, at each of which sat a student, head bent low, scribbling on a roll of parchment. The only sound was the scratching of quills and the occasional rustle as somebody adjusted their parchment. It was clearly exam time. Sunshine was streaming through the high windows onto the bent heads, which shone chestnut and copper and gold in the bright light. Harry looked around carefully. Snape had to be here somewhere. This was his memory. And there he was, at a table right behind Harry. Harry stared. Snape the teenager had a stringy, pallid look about him, like a plant kept in the dark. His hair was lank and greasy and was flopping onto the table. His hooked nose barely half an inch from the surface of the parchment as he scribbled. Harry moved around behind Snape and read the heading of the examination paper. Defence against the Dark Arts. Ordinary, wizarding level. So Snape had to be 15 or 16, around Harry's own age. His hand was flying across the parchment. He had written at least a foot more than his closest neighbours, and yet his writing was minuscule and cramped. 5 more minutes. The voice made Harry jump. Turning, he saw the top of Professor Flitwick's head moving between the desks a short distance away. Professor Flitwick was walking past a boy with untidy black hair, very untidy black hair. Harry moved so quickly that, had he been solid, he would have knocked desks flying. Instead, he seemed to slide, dreamlike, across 2 aisles and up a third. The back of the black-haired boy's head drew nearer, and he was straightening up now, putting down his quill, pulling his roll of parchment towards him so as to reread what he had written. Harry stopped in front of the desk and gazed down at his 15-year-old father. Excitement exploded in the pit of his stomach. It was as though he was looking at himself, but with deliberate mistakes. James's eyes were hazel, his nose was slightly longer than Harry's, and there was no scar on his forehead. But they had the same thin face, same mouth, same eyebrows. James's hair stuck up at the back exactly as Harry's did. His hands could have been Harry's, and Harry could tell that, when James stood up, they would be within an inch of each other in height. James yawned hugely and rumpled up his hair, making it even messier than it had been. Then, with a glance towards Professor Flitwick, he turned in his seat and grinned at a boy sitting 4 seats behind him. With another shock of excitement, Harry saw Sirius give James the thumbs up. Sirius was lounging in his chair at his ease, tilting it back on 2 legs. He was very good-looking. His dark hair fell into his eyes with a sort of casual elegance neither James's nor Harry's could ever have achieved, and a girl sitting behind him was eyeing him hopefully, though he didn't seem to have noticed. And 2 seats along from this girl, Harry's stomach gave another pleasurable squirm. Was Remus Lupin? He looked rather pale and peaky. Was the full moon approaching? And was absorbed in the exam. As he reread his answers, he scratched his chin with the end of his quill, frowning slightly. So that meant Wormtail had to be around here somewhere too, and sure enough, Harry spotted him within seconds, a small, mousy-haired boy with a pointed nose. Wormtail looked anxious. He was chewing his fingernails, staring down at his paper, scuffing the ground with his toes. Every now and then, he glanced hopefully at his neighbour's paper. Harry stared at Wormtail for a moment, then back at James, who was now doodling on a bit of scrap parchment. He had drawn a snitch on, and was now tracing the letters L-E. What did they stand for? "Quills down, please," squeaked Professor Flitwick. "That means you too, Stebbins. Please remain seated while I collect your parchment. Accio!" Over 100 rolls of parchment zoomed into the air and into Professor Flitwick's outstretched arms, knocking him backwards off his feet. Several people laughed, and a couple of students at the front desks got up, took hold of Professor Flitwick beneath the elbows and lifted him back to his feet. Thank you, panted Professor Flitwick. "Very well, everybody. You're free to go." Harry looked down at his father, who had hastily crossed out the L-E he had been embellishing, jumping to his feet, stuffed his quill and the exam paper into his bag, which he slung over his back, and stood waiting for Sirius to join him. Harry looked around and glimpsed Snape a short way away, moving between the tables towards the doors to the entrance hall, still absorbed in his own exam paper. Round shoulders yet angular, he walked in a twitchy manner that recalled a spider, and his oily hair was jumping about his face. A gang of chattering girls separated Snape from James, Sirius and Lupin, and by planting himself in their midst, Harry managed to keep Snape in sight, while straining his ears to catch the voices of James and his friends. "Did you like question 10, Moony?" asked Sirius, as they emerged into the entrance hall. "Loved it," said Lupin briskly. "Give 5 signs that identify the werewolf. Excellent question." "Do you think you managed to get all the signs?" said James in tones of mock concern. "Think I did," said Lupin seriously, as they joined the crowd thronging around the front doors, eager to get out into the sunlit grounds. 1, he's sitting on my chair. 2, he's wearing my clothes. 3, his name's Remus Lupin. Wormtail was the only one who didn't laugh. "I got the snout shape, the pupils of the eyes and the tufted tail," he said anxiously, "but I couldn't think what else." "How thick are you, Wormtail?" said James impatiently. "You run around with a werewolf once a month." "Keep your voice down," implored Lupin. Harry looked anxiously behind him again. Snape remained close by, still buried in his exam questions. But this was Snape's memory, and Harry was sure that if Snape chose to wander off in a different direction once outside in the grounds, he, Harry, would not be able to follow James any further. To his intense relief, however, when James and his 3 friends strode off down the lawn towards the lake, Snape followed, still poring over the exam paper and apparently with no fixed idea of where he was going. By keeping a little ahead of him, Harry managed to maintain a close watch on James and the others. "Well, I thought that paper was a piece of cake," he heard Sirius say. "I'll be surprised if I don't get outstanding on it at least." "Me too," said James. He put his hand in his pocket and took out a struggling golden snitch. "Where'd you get that?" "Nicked it," said James casually. He started playing with the snitch, allowing it to fly as much as a foot away before seizing it again. His reflexes were excellent. Wormtail watched him in awe. They stopped in the shade of the very same beech tree on the edge of the lake where Harry, Ron and Hermione had once spent a Sunday finishing their homework, and threw themselves down onto the grass. Harry looked over his shoulder yet again and saw, to his delight, that Snape had settled himself on the grass in the dense shadow of a clump of bushes. He was as deeply immersed in the owl paper as ever, which left Harry free to sit down on the grass between the beech and the bushes and watch the foursome under the tree. The sunlight was dazzling on the smooth surface of the lake, on the bank of which the group of laughing girls who had just left the great hall were sitting, with their shoes and socks off, cooling their feet in the water. Lupin had pulled out a book and was reading. Sirius stared around at the students milling over the grass, looking rather haughty and bored, but very handsomely so. James was still playing with a snitch, letting it zoom further and further away, almost escaping but always grabbed at the last second. Wormtail was watching him with his mouth open. Every time James made a particularly difficult catch, Wormtail gasped and applauded. After 5 minutes of this, Harry wondered why James didn't tell Wormtail to get a grip on himself, but James seemed to be enjoying the attention. Harry noticed that his father had a habit of rumpling up his hair as though to keep it from getting too tidy, and he also kept looking over at the girls by the water's edge. "Put that away, will you?" said Sirius finally, as James made a fine catch and Wormtail let out a cheer, before Wormtail wets himself with excitement. Wormtail turned slightly pink, but James grinned. "If it bothers you," he said, stuffing the snitch back in his pocket. Harry had the distinct impression that Sirius was the only one for whom James would have stopped showing off. "I'm bored," said Sirius. "Wish it was full moon." "You might," said Lupin darkly from behind his book. "We've still got Transfiguration. If you're bored, you could test me. Here." And he held out his book, but Sirius snorted. "I don't need to look at that rubbish. I know it all." "This'll liven you up, Padfoot," said James quietly. "Look who it is." Sirius's head turned. He became very still, like a dog that had scented a rabbit. "Excellent," he said softly. "Snivelous." Harry turned to see what Sirius was looking at. Snape was on his feet again, and was stowing the owl paper in his bag. As he left the shadows of the bushes and set off across the grass, Sirius and James stood up. Lupin and Wormtail remained sitting. Lupin was still staring down at his book, though his eyes were not moving and a faint frown line had appeared between his eyebrows. Wormtail was looking from Sirius and James to Snape with a look of avid anticipation on his face. "All right, Snivelus," said James loudly. Snape reacted so fast it was as though he had been expecting an attack. Dropping his bag, he plunged his hand inside his robes, and his wand was halfway into the air when James shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Snape's wand flew 12 feet into the air and fell with a little thud in the grass behind him. Sirius let out a bark of laughter. "Impedimenta," he said, pointing his wand at Snape, who was knocked off his feet halfway through a dive towards his own fallen wand. Students all around had turned to watch. Some of them had got to their feet and were edging nearer. Some looked apprehensive, others entertained. Snape lay panting on the ground. James and Sirius advanced on him, wands raised. James glanced over his shoulder at the girls at the water's edge as he went. Wormtail was on his feet now, watching hungrily, edging around Lupin to get a clearer view. "How'd the exam go, Snively?" said James. "I was watching him. His nose was touching the parchment," said Sirius viciously. "There'll be great grease marks all over it. They won't be able to read a word." Several people watching laughed. Snape was clearly unpopular. Wormtail sniggered shrilly. Snape was trying to get up, but the jinx was still operating on him. He was struggling, as though bound by invisible ropes. "You wait," he panted, staring up at James with an expression of purest loathing. You wait." "Wait for what?" said Sirius coolly. "What are you going to do, Snively? Wipe your nose on us?" Snape let out a stream of mixed swear words and hexes, but with his wand 10 feet away, nothing happened. "Wash out your mouth," said James coldly. "Scourgify." Pink soap bubbles streamed from Snape's mouth at once. The froth was covering his lips, making him gag, choking him. "Leave him alone!" James and Sirius looked around. James's free hand had immediately jumped to his hair. It was one of the girls from the lake edge. She had thick, dark, red hair that fell to her shoulders and startlingly green, almond-shaped eyes. Harry's eyes. Harry's mother. "All right, Evans," said James, and the tone of his voice was suddenly pleasant, deeper, more mature. "Leave him alone," Lily repeated. She was looking at James with every sign of great dislike. "What's he done to you?" "Well," said James, appearing to deliberate the point, "it's more the fact that he exists. If you know what I mean." Many of the surrounding students laughed, Sirius and Wormtail included, but Lupin, still apparently intent on his book, didn't, and nor did Lily. "You think you're funny," she said coldly, "but you're just an arrogant, bullying toe-rag. Potter, leave him alone." "I will if you go out with me, Evans," said James quickly. "Go on, go out with me, and I'll never lay a wand on old Snively again." Behind him the impediment jinx was wearing off. Snape was beginning to inch towards the fallen wand, spitting out soap suds as he crawled. "I wouldn't go out with you if it was a choice between you and the giant squid," said Lily. "Bad luck, Prongs," said Sirius briskly, and turned back to Snape. "Oi!" But too late. Snape had directed his wand straight at James. There was a flash of light, and a gash appeared on the side of James's face, spattering his robes with blood. James whirled about. A second flash of light later, Snape was hanging upside down in the air, his robes falling over his head to reveal skinny, pallid legs and a pair of greying underpants. Many people in the small crowd cheered. Sirius, James and Wormtail roared with laughter. Lily, whose furious expression had twitched for an instant, as though she was going to smile, said, "Let him down." "Certainly," said James, and he jerked his wand upwards. Snape fell into a crumpled heap on the ground. Disentangling himself from his robes, he got quickly to his feet. Wand up, but Sirius said, "Petrificus totalus," and Snape keeled over again, rigid as a board. "Leave him alone," Lily shouted. She had her own wand out now. James and Sirius eyed it warily. "Ah, Evans, don't make me hex you," said James earnestly. "Take the curse off him, then." James sighed deeply, then turned to Snape and muttered the counter-curse. "There you go," he said, as Snape struggled to his feet. "You're lucky Evans was here, Snivelus. I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her." Lily blinked. "Fine," she said coolly. "I won't bother in future, and I'd wash your pants if I were you, Snivelus." "Apologise to Evans," James snored at Snape, his wand pointed threateningly at him. "I don't want you to make him apologise," Lily shouted, rounding on James. "You're as bad as he is." "What?" yelled James. "I'd never call you a you-know-what. Messing up your hair because you think it looks cool to look like you've just got off your broomstick, showing off with that stupid snitch, walking down corridors and hexing anyone who annoys you just because you can. I'm surprised your broomstick can get off the ground with that fat head on it. You make me sick." She turned on her heel and hurried away. "Evans!" James shouted after her. "Hey, Evans!" But she didn't look back. "What is it with her?" said James, trying and failing to look as though this was a throwaway question of no real importance to him. Reading between the lines, "I'd say she thinks you're a bit conceited, mate," said Sirius. "Right," said James, who looked furious now. "Right." There was another flash of light, and Snape was once again hanging upside down in the air. "Who wants to see me take off Snively's pants?" But whether James really did take off Snape's pants, Harry never found out. A hand had closed tight over his upper arm, closed with a pincer-like grip. Wincing, Harry looked around to see who had hold of him and saw, with a thrill of horror, a fully grown, adult-sized Snape standing right beside him, white with rage. Having fun? Harry felt himself rising into the air. The summer's day evaporated around him. He was floating upwards through icy blackness, Snape's hand still tight upon his upper arm. Then, with a swooping feeling, as though he had turned head over heels in mid-air, his feet hit the stone floor of Snape's dungeon, and he was standing again beside the pensieve on Snape's desk in the shadowy present-day Potion Master's study. "So," said Snape, gripping Harry's arm so tightly Harry's hand was starting to feel numb. "So, been enjoying yourself, Potter?" No, said Harry, trying to free his arm. It was scary. Snape's lips were shaking. His face was white. His teeth were bared. "Amusing man, your father, wasn't he?" said Snape, shaking Harry so hard his glasses slipped down his nose. I didn't." Snape threw Harry from him with all his might. Harry fell hard onto the dungeon floor. "You will not tell anybody what you saw," Snape bellowed. "No," said Harry, getting to his feet as far from Snape as he could. "No, of course I will. Get out! Get out! I don't want to see you in this office ever again." And as Harry hurtled towards the door, a jar of dead cockroaches exploded over his head. He wrenched the door open and flew along the corridor, stopping only when he had put 3 floors between himself and Snape. There he leaned against the wall, panting and rubbing his bruised arm. He had no desire at all to return to Gryffindor Tower so early, nor to tell Ron and Hermione what he had just seen. What was making Harry feel so horrified and unhappy was not being shouted at or having jars thrown at him. It was that he knew how it felt to be humiliated in the middle of a circle of onlookers, knew exactly how Snape had felt as his father had taunted him, and that judging from what he had just seen, his father had been every bit as arrogant as Snape had always told him. Chapter 29. Careers Advice. "But why haven't you got occlumency lessons anymore?" said Hermione, frowning. "I've told you," Harry muttered. "Snape reckons I can carry on by myself now I've got the basics." "So you've stopped having funny dreams?" said Hermione sceptically. "Pretty much," said Harry, not looking at her. "Well, I don't think Snape should stop until you're absolutely sure you can control them," said Hermione indignantly. "Harry, I think you should go back to him and ask." "No," said Harry forcefully. "Just drop it, Hermione, okay?" It was the first day of the Easter holidays, and Hermione, as was her custom, had spent a large part of the day drawing up revision timetables for the 3 of them. Harry and Ron had let her do it. It was easier than arguing with her, and in any case they might come in useful. Ron had been startled to discover there were only 6 weeks left until their exams. "How can that come as a shock?" Hermione demanded, as she tapped each little square on Ron's timetable with her wand so that it flashed a different colour according to its subject. "I don't know," said Ron. "There's been a lot going on." "Well, there you are," she said, handing him the timetable. "If you follow that, you should do fine." Ron looked down it gloomily, but then brightened. "You've given me an evening off every week." "That's for Quidditch practice," said Hermione. The smile faded from Ron's face. "What's the point?" he said. "We've got about as much chance of winning the Quidditch Cup this year as Dad's got of becoming Minister for Magic." Hermione said nothing. She was looking at Harry, who was staring blankly at the opposite wall of the common room, while Crookshanks pawed at his hand, trying to get his ears scratched. "What's wrong, Harry?" "What?" he said quickly. Nothing." He seized his copy of Defensive Magical Theory and pretended to be looking something up in the index. Crookshanks gave him up as a bad job and slunk away under Hermione's chair. "I saw Cho earlier," said Hermione tentatively. "She looked really miserable too. Have you two had a row again?" "What? Oh, yeah, we have," said Harry, seizing gratefully at the excuse. "What about?" "That sneak friend of hers, Marietta," said Harry. "Yeah, well, I don't blame you," said Ron angrily, setting down his revision timetable. "If it hadn't been for her—" Ron went into a rant about Marietta Edgecombe, which Harry found helpful. All he had to do was look angry, nod and say, "Yeah, and that's right," whenever Ron drew breath, leaving his mind free to dwell even more miserably on what he had seen in the Pensieve. He felt as though the memory of it was eating him from inside. He had been so sure his parents were wonderful people that he had never had the slightest difficulty in disbelieving the aspersions Snape cast on his father's character. Hadn't people like Hagrid and Sirius told Harry how wonderful his father had been? Yeah, well, look what Sirius was like himself, and a nagging voice inside Harry's head. He was as bad, wasn't he? Yes, he had once overheard Professor McGonagall saying that his father and Sirius had been troublemakers at school, but she had described them as forerunners of the Weasley twins. And Harry could not imagine Fred and George dangling someone upside down for the fun of it, not unless they really loathed them. Perhaps Malfoy or somebody who really deserved it. Harry tried to make a case for Snape, having deserved what he had suffered at James's hands. But hadn't Lily asked, "What's he done to you?" And hadn't James replied, "It's more the fact that he exists, if you know what I mean." Hadn't James started it all simply because Sirius had said he was bored? Harry remembered Lupin saying back in Grimmauld Place that Dumbledore had made him prefect in the hope that he would be able to exercise some control over James and Sirius. But in the Pensieve, he had sat there and let it all happen. Harry kept reminding himself that Lily had intervened. His mother had been decent, yet the memory of the look on her face as she had shouted at James disturbed him quite as much as anything else. She had clearly loathed James, and Harry simply could not understand how they could have ended up married. Once or twice he even wondered whether James had forced her into it. For nearly 5 years, the thought of his father had been a source of comfort, of inspiration. Whenever someone had told him he was like James, he had glowed with pride inside, and now he felt cold and miserable at the thought of him. The weather grew breezier, brighter and warmer as the Easter holidays passed, but Harry, along with the rest of the 5th and 7th years, was trapped inside, revising, traipsing back and forth to the library. Harry pretended his bad mood had no other cause but the approaching exams. And as his fellow Gryffindors were sick of studying themselves, his excuse went unchallenged. "Harry, I'm talking to you. Can you hear me?" "Huh?" He looked around. Ginny Weasley, looking very windswept, had joined him at the library table, where he had been sitting alone. It was late on Sunday evening. Hermione had gone back to Gryffindor Tower to revise ancient runes, and Ron had Quidditch practice. Hi," said Harry, pulling his books towards him. "How come you're not at practice?" "It's over," said Ginny. "Ron had to take Jack Sloper up to the hospital wing." "Why?" "Well, we're not sure, but we think he knocked himself out with his own bat." She sighed heavily. "Anyway, a package just arrived. It's only just got through Umbridge's new screening process." She hoisted a box wrapped in brown paper onto the table. It had clearly been unwrapped and carelessly rewrapped. There was a scribbled note across it in red ink, reading, "Inspected and passed by the Hogwarts High Inquisitor." "It's Easter eggs from Mum," said Ginny. "There's one for you. There you go." She handed him a handsome chocolate egg decorated with small, iced snitches, and according to the packaging, containing a bag of fizzing Whizbees. Harry looked at it for a moment, and then to his horror felt a lump rise in his throat. "Are you okay, Harry?" Ginny asked quietly. "Yeah, I'm fine," said Harry gruffly. The lump in his throat was painful. He did not understand why an Easter egg should have made him feel like this. "You seem really down lately," Ginny persisted. "You know, I'm sure if you just talk to Cho—" "It's not Cho I want to talk to," said Harry brusquely. "Who is it then?" asked Ginny. I... He glanced around to make sure nobody was listening. Madame Pince was several shelves away, stamping out a pile of books for a frantic-looking Hannah Abbott. "I wish I could talk to Sirius," he muttered, "but I know I can't." More to give himself something to do than because he really wanted any, Harry unwrapped his Easter egg, broke off a large bit and put it into his mouth. "Well," said Ginny slowly, helping herself to a bit of egg too, "if you really want to talk to Sirius, I expect we could think of a way to do it." "Come on," said Harry hopelessly, "with Umbridge policing the fires and reading all our mail?" "The thing about growing up with Fred and George," said Ginny thoughtfully, "is that you sort of start thinking anything's possible if you've got enough nerve." Harry looked at her. Perhaps it was the effect of the chocolate. Lupin had always advised eating some after encounters with Dementors, or simply because he had finally spoken aloud the wish that he had been burning inside him for a week. But he felt a bit more hopeful. What do you think you are doing?" "Oh, damn," whispered Ginny, jumping to her feet. "I forgot." Madame Pince was swooping down on them, but her shriveled face contorted with rage. "Chocolate? In the library?" she screamed. "Out! Out! Out!" And whipping out her wand, she caused Harry's books, bag and ink bottle to chase him and Ginny from the library, whacking them repeatedly over the head as they ran. As though to underline the importance of their upcoming examinations, a batch of pamphlets, leaflets and notices concerning various wizarding careers appeared on the tables in Gryffindor Tower shortly before the end of the holidays, along with yet another notice on the board which read, "Careers Advice. All fifth years are required to attend a short meeting with their head of house during the first week of the summer term to discuss their future careers. Times of individual appointments are listed below." Harry looked down the list and found that he was expected in Professor McGonagall's office at 2:30 on Monday, which would mean missing most of divination. He and the other fifth years spent a considerable part of the final weekend of the Easter holiday break reading all the careers information that had been left there for their perusal. "Well, I don't fancy healing," said Ron on the last evening of the holidays. He was immersed in a leaflet that carried the crossed bone and wand emblem of St. Mungo's on its front. "It says here you need at least an E at Newt level in potions, herbology, transfiguration, charms and defence against the dark arts. I mean, blimey, don't want much, do they?" "Well, it's a very responsible job, isn't it?" said Hermione absently. She was poring over a bright pink and orange leaflet that was headed, "So you think you like to work in a Muggle relation? You don't seem to need any qualifications to liaise with Muggles. All they want is an owl in Muggle studies. Much more important is your enthusiasm, patience and a good sense of fun." "You need more than a good sense of fun to liaise with my uncle," said Harry darkly. "Good sense of when to duck, more like." He was halfway through a pamphlet on wizard banking. "Listen to this. Are you seeking a challenging career involving travel, adventure, and substantial danger-related treasure bonuses? Then consider a position with Gringotts Wizarding Bank, who are currently recruiting curse breakers for thrilling opportunities abroad. They want arithmancy. No, though you could do it, Hermione." "I don't much fancy banking," said Hermione vaguely, now immersed in "Have you got what it takes to train security trolls?" "Hey," said a voice in Harry's ear. He looked around. Fred and George had come to join him. Ginny's had a word with us about you," said Fred, stretching out his legs on the table in front of them and causing several booklets on careers with the Ministry of Magic to slide off onto the floor. "She says you need to talk to Sirius." "What?" said Hermione sharply, freezing with her hand halfway towards picking up "Make a bang at the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes." "Yeah," said Harry, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I thought I'd like—" "Don't be so ridiculous," said Hermione, straightening up and looking at him as though she could not believe her eyes. "With Umbridge groping around in the fires and frisking all the owls?" "Well, we think we can find a way around that," said George, stretching and smiling. "It's a simple matter of causing a diversion. Now, you might have noticed that we have been rather quiet on the mayhem front during the Easter holidays. What was the point, we asked ourselves, of disrupting leisure time?" continued Fred. "No point at all, we answered ourselves. And of course, we'd have messed up people's revision too, which would be the very last thing we'd want to do." He gave Hermione a sanctimonious little nod. She looked rather taken aback by his thoughtfulness. But it's business as usual from tomorrow, Fred continued briskly, and if we're going to be causing a bit of uproar, why not do it so that Harry can have his chat with Sirius? Yes, but still, said Hermione, with an air of explaining something very simple to somebody very obtuse. Even if you do cause a diversion, how is Harry supposed to talk to him? Umbridge's office, said Harry quietly. He had been thinking about it for a fortnight, and could come up with no alternative. Umbridge herself had told him that the only fire that was not being watched was her own. Are you insane? Said Hermione in a hushed voice. Ron had lowered his leaflet on jobs on the cultivated fungus trade and was watching the conversation warily. I don't think so, said Harry, shrugging. And how are you going to get in there in the first place? Harry was ready for this question. Sirius's knife, he said. Excuse me? Christmas before last, Sirius gave me a knife that'll open any lock, said Harry. So even if she's bewitched the door, so Alohomora won't work, which I bet she has. What do you think about this? Hermione demanded of Ron, and Harry was reminded irresistibly of Mrs. Weasley appealing to her husband during Harry's first dinner in Grimmauld Place. I don't know, said Ron, looking alarmed at being asked to give an opinion. If Harry wants to do it, it's up to him, isn't it? Spoken like a true friend and Weasley, said Fred, clapping Ron hard on the back. Right then, we're thinking of doing it tomorrow, just after lessons, because it should cause maximum impact if everybody's in the corridors. Harry will set it off in the east wing somewhere. Draw her right away from her own office. I reckon we should be able to guarantee you, 20 minutes? He said, looking at George. Easy, said George. What sort of diversion is it? Asked Ron. You'll see, little bro, said Fred, as he and George got up again. At least you will if you trot along to Gregory, the smarmies corridor, around about 5 o'clock tomorrow. Harry awoke very early the next day, feeling almost as anxious as he had done on the morning of his disciplinary hearing at the Ministry of Magic. It was not only the prospect of breaking into Umbridge's office and using her fire to speak to Sirius that was making him feel nervous, though that was certainly bad enough. Today also happened to be the first time Harry would be in close proximity to Snape since Snape had thrown him out of his office. After lying in bed for a while, thinking about the day ahead, Harry got up very quietly and moved across to the window beside Neville's bed and stared out onto a truly glorious morning. The sky was a clear, misty, opalescent blue. Directly ahead of him, Harry could see the towering beech tree below, which his father had once tormented Snape. He was not sure what Sirius could possibly say to him that would make up for what he had seen in the Pensieve, but he was desperate to hear Sirius's own account of what had happened, to know of any mitigating factors there might have been, any excuse at all for his father's behaviour. Something caught Harry's attention, movement in the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Harry squinted into the sun and saw Hagrid emerging from between the trees. He seemed to be limping. As Harry watched, Hagrid staggered to the door of his cabin and disappeared inside it. Harry watched the cabin for several minutes. Hagrid did not emerge again, but smoke furled from the chimney, so Hagrid could not be so badly injured that he was unequal to stoking the fire. Harry turned away from the window, headed back to the trunk, and started to dress. With the prospect of forcing entry into Umbridge's office ahead, Harry had never expected the day to be a restful one, but he had not reckoned on Hermione's almost continual attempts to dissuade him from what he was planning to do at 5 o'clock. For the first time ever, she was at least as inattentive to Professor Binns in History of Magic as Harry and Ron were, keeping up a stream of whispered admonitions that Harry tried very hard to ignore. And if she does catch you there, apart from being expelled, she'll be able to guess you've been talking to Snuffles, and this time I expect she'll force you to drink Veritaserum and answer her questions. Hermione, said Ron in a low and indignant voice, are you going to stop telling Harry off and listen to Binns, or am I going to have to take my own notes? You take notes for a change, it won't kill you. By the time they reached the dungeons, neither Harry nor Ron was speaking to Hermione. Undeterred, she took advantage of their silence to maintain an uninterrupted flow of dire warnings, all uttered under her breath, in a vehement hiss that caused Seamus to waste 5 whole minutes checking his cauldron for leaks. Snape, meanwhile, seemed to have decided to act as though Harry were invisible. Harry was, of course, well used to this tactic, as it was one of Uncle Vernon's favourites, and on the whole was grateful he had to suffer nothing worse. In fact, compared to what he usually had to endure from Snape, in a way of taunts and snide remarks, he found the new approach something of an improvement, and was pleased to find that when left well alone, he was able to concoct an invigoration draught quite easily. At the end of the lesson, he scooped some of the potion into a flask, corked it, and took it up to Snape's desk for marking, feeling that he might at least have scraped an E. He had just turned away when he heard a smashing noise. Malfoy gave a gleeful yell of laughter. Harry whipped around. His potion sample lay in pieces on the floor, and Snape was watching him with a look of gloating pleasure. "Whoops," he said softly. "Another 0 then, Potter." Harry was too incensed to speak. He strode back to his cauldron, intending to fill another flask and force Snape to mark it, but saw to his horror that the rest of the contents had vanished. "I'm sorry," said Hermione, with her hands over her mouth. "I'm really sorry, Harry. I thought you'd finished, so I cleared up." Harry could not bring himself to answer. When the bell rang, he hurried out of the dungeon without a backwards glance, and made sure that he found himself a seat between Neville and Seamus for lunch, so that Hermione could not start nagging him again about using Umbridge's office. He was in such a bad mood by the time he got to divination that he had quite forgotten his careers appointment with Professor McGonagall, remembering it only when Ron asked him why he wasn't in her office. He hurtled back upstairs and arrived out of breath, only a few minutes late. "Sorry, Professor," he panted as he closed the door. "I forgot." "No matter, Potter," she said briskly, but as she spoke, somebody else sniffed from the corner. Harry looked around. Professor Umbridge was sitting there, a clipboard on her knee, a fussy little pie frill around her neck, and a small, horribly smug smile on her face. "Sit down, Potter," said Professor McGonagall tersely. Her hand shook slightly as she shuffled the many pamphlets littering her desk. Harry sat down with his back to Umbridge and did his best to pretend he could not hear the scratching of her quill on her clipboard. "Well, Potter, this meeting is to talk over any career ideas you might have, and to help you decide which subjects you should continue into 6th and 7th years," said Professor McGonagall. "Have you had any thoughts about what you might like to do after you leave Hogwarts?" Said Harry. He was finding the scratching noise from behind him very distracting. "Yes," Professor McGonagall prompted Harry. "Yeah, well, I thought of maybe being an aura," Harry mumbled. "You'd need top grades for that," said Professor McGonagall, extracting a small, dark leaflet from under the mass of her desk and opening it. "They ask for a minimum of 5 newts, and nothing under exceeds expectations grade, I see. Then you would be required to undergo a stringent series of character and aptitude tests at the Aura office. It's a difficult career path, Potter. They only take the best. In fact, I don't think anybody has been taken on in the last 3 years." At this moment, Professor Umbridge gave a very tiny cough, as though she was trying to see how quietly she could do it. Professor McGonagall ignored her. "You'll want to know which subjects you ought to take, I suppose," she went on, talking a little louder than before. "Yes," said Harry. Defence against the dark arts, I suppose." "Naturally," said Professor McGonagall crisply. "I would also advise—" Professor Umbridge gave another cough, a little more audible this time. Professor McGonagall closed her eyes for a moment, opened them again, and continued as though nothing had happened. "I would also advise transfiguration, because auras frequently need to transfigure or untransfigure in their work. And I ought to tell you now, Potter, that I do not accept students into my newt classes unless they have achieved exceeds expectations or higher at ordinary wizarding level. I'd say you're averaging acceptable at the moment, so you'll need to put in some good hard work before the exams to stand a chance of continuing. Then you ought to do charms, also useful, and potions. Yes, Potter, potions," she added, with the merest flicker of a smile. "Poisons and antidotes are essential study for auras, and I must tell you that Professor Snape absolutely refuses to take students who get anything other than outstanding in their owls, so—" Professor Umbridge gave her most pronounced cough yet. "May I offer you a cough drop, Dolores?" Professor McGonagall asked curtly, without looking at Professor Umbridge. "Oh, no, thank you very much," said Umbridge, with that simpering laugh Harry hated so much. "I just wondered whether I could make the teeniest interruption, Minerva." "I dare say you'll find you can," said Professor McGonagall through tightly gritted teeth. I was just wondering whether Mr. Potter has quite the temperament for an aura, said Professor Umbridge sweetly. Where are you? Said Professor McGonagall haughtily. Well, Potter, she continued, as though there had been no interruption, if you are serious in this ambition, I would advise you to concentrate hard on bringing your transfiguration and potions up to scratch. I see Professor Flitwick has graded you between acceptable and exceeds expectations for the last 2 years, so your charm work seems satisfactory. As for defence against the dark arts, your marks have been generally high. Professor Lupin in particular thought you. Are you quite sure you wouldn't like a cough drop, Dolores? Oh, no need, thank you, Minerva, simpered Professor Umbridge, who had just coughed her loudest yet. I was just concerned that you might not have Harry's most recent defence against the dark arts marks in front of you. I'm quite sure I slipped in a note. What, this thing? Said Professor McGonagall in a tone of revulsion, as she pulled a sheet of pink parchment from between the leaves of Harry's folder. She glanced down it, her eyebrows slightly raised, and then placed it back into the folder without comment. Yes, as I was saying, Potter, Professor Lupin thought you showed a pronounced aptitude for the subject, and obviously for an aura. Did you not understand my note, Minerva? Asked Professor Umbridge in honeyed tones, quite forgetting to cough. Of course I understood it, said Professor McGonagall, her teeth clenched so tightly the words came out a little muffled. Well then, I am confused. I'm afraid I don't quite understand how you can give Mr. Potter false hope that... False hope? Repeated Professor McGonagall, still refusing to look around at Professor Umbridge. He has achieved high marks in all his defence against the dark arts tests. I'm terribly sorry to have to contradict you, Minerva, but as you will see from my note, Harry has been achieving very poor results in his classes with me. I should have made my meaning plainer, said Professor McGonagall, turning at last to look at Umbridge directly in the eyes. He has achieved high marks in all defence against the dark arts tests set by a competent teacher. Professor Umbridge's smile vanished as suddenly as a light bulb blowing. She sat back in her chair, turned a sheet on her clipboard, and began scribbling very fast indeed, her bulging eyes rolling from side to side. Professor McGonagall turned back to Harry, her thin nostrils flared, her eyes burning. Any questions, Potter? Yes, said Harry. What sort of character and aptitude tests do the Ministry do on you, if you get enough newts? Well, you'll need to demonstrate the ability to react well to pressure, and so forth, said Professor McGonagall. Perseverance and dedication, because aura training takes a further 3 years, not to mention very high skills in practical defence. It will mean a lot more study even after you've left school, so unless you're prepared to... I think you'll also find, said Umbridge, her voice very cold now, that the Ministry looks into the records of those applying to be auras, their criminal records. Unless you're prepared to take even more exams after Hogwarts, you should really look at another. Which means that this boy has as much chance of becoming an aura as Dumbledore has of ever returning to this school. A very good chance, then, said Professor McGonagall. Potter has a criminal record, said Umbridge loudly. Potter has been cleared of all charges, said McGonagall, even more loudly. Professor Umbridge stood up. She was so short that this did not make a great deal of difference, but her fussy, simpering demeanour had given place to a hard fury that made her broad, flabby face look oddly sinister. Potter has no chance whatsoever of becoming an aura. Professor McGonagall got to her feet too, and in her case this was a much more impressive move. She towered over Professor Umbridge. Potter, she said in ringing tones, I will assist you to become an aura, if it is the last thing I do. If I have to coach you nightly, I will make sure you achieve the required results. The Minister for Magic will never employ Harry Potter, said Umbridge, her voice rising furiously. There may well be a new Minister for Magic by the time Potter is ready to join, shouted Professor McGonagall. Aha! Shrieked Professor Umbridge, pointing a stubby finger at McGonagall. Yes, of course. That's what you want, isn't it, Minerva McGonagall? You want Cornelius Fudge replaced by Albus Dumbledore. You think you'll be where I am, don't you? Senior Under-Secretary to the Minister and Headmistress to boot. You are raving, said Professor McGonagall, superbly disdainful. Potter, that concludes our careers consultation. Harry swung his bag over his shoulder and hurried out of the room, not daring to look at Professor Umbridge. He could hear her and Professor McGonagall continuing to shout at each other all the way back along the corridor. Professor Umbridge was still breathing, as though she had just run a race, when she strode into their Defence Against the Dark Arts lesson that afternoon. "I hope you've thought better of what you're planning to do, Harry," Hermione whispered, the moment they had opened their books to Chapter 34, Non-Retaliation and Negotiation. "Umbridge looks like she's in a really bad mood already." Every now and then Umbridge shot glowering looks at Harry, who kept his head down, staring at defensive magical theory, his eyes unfocused, thinking. He could just imagine Professor McGonagall's reaction if he was caught trespassing in Professor Umbridge's office mere hours after she had vouched for him. There was nothing to stop him simply going back to Gryffindor Tower and hoping that sometime during the next summer holidays he would have a chance to ask Sirius about the scene he had witnessed in the Pensieve. Nothing! Except that the thought of taking this sensible course of action made him feel as though a lead weight had dropped into his stomach. And then there was the matter of Fred and George, whose diversion was already planned. Not to mention the knife Sirius had given him, which was currently residing in his school bag along with his father's old invisibility cloak. But the fact remained that if he was caught... "Dumbledore sacrificed himself to help you in school, Harry," whispered Hermione, raising her book to hide her face from Umbridge. "And if you get thrown out today, it will have all been for nothing." He could abandon the plan and simply learn to live with the memory of what his father had done on a summer's day more than 20 years ago. And then he remembered Sirius and the fire upstairs in the Gryffindor common room. "You're less like your father than I thought. The risk would have been what made it fun for James." But did he want to be like his father anymore? "Harry, don't do it. Please don't do it," Hermione said in an anguished tone as the bell rang at the end of the class. He did not answer. He did not know what to do. Ron seemed determined to give neither his opinion nor his advice. He would not look at Harry, though when Hermione opened her mouth to try dissuading Harry some more, he said in a low voice, "Give it a rest, okay? He can make up his own mind." Harry's heart beat very fast as he left the classroom. He was halfway along the corridor, outside, when he heard the unmistakable sounds of a diversion going off in the distance. There were screams and yells reverberating from somewhere above them. People exiting the classrooms all around Harry were stopping in their tracks and looking up at the ceiling fearfully. Umbridge came pelting out of her classroom as fast as her short legs would carry her. Pulling out her wand, she hurried off in the opposite direction. It was now or never. "Harry, please," Hermione pleaded weakly. But he had made up his mind. Hitching his bag more securely onto his shoulder, he set off at a run, weaving in and out of students now hurrying in the opposite direction to see what all the fuss was about in the East Wing. Harry reached the corridor to Umbridge's office and found it deserted. Dashing behind a large suit of armour, whose helmet creaked around to watch him, he pulled open his bag, seized Sirius's knife and donned the invisibility cloak. He then crept slowly and carefully back out from behind the suit of armour and along the corridor until he reached Umbridge's door. He inserted the blade of the magical knife into the crack around it and moved it gently up and down, then withdrew it. There was a tiny click and the door swung open. He ducked inside the office, closed the door quickly behind him and looked around. Nothing was moving except the horrible kittens that were still frolicking on the wall plates above the confiscated broomsticks. Harry pulled off his cloak and, striding over to the fireplace, found what he was looking for within seconds, a small box containing a glittering Floo powder. He crouched down in front of the empty grate, his hands shaking. He had never done this before, though he thought he knew how it must work. Sticking his head into the fireplace, he took a large pinch of powder and dropped it onto the logs stacked neatly beneath him. They exploded at once into emerald green flames. "Number 12, Grimmauld Place," Harry said loudly and clearly. It was one of the most curious sensations he had ever experienced. He had travelled by Floo powder before, of course, but then it had been his entire body that had spun around and around in the flames, through the network of wizarding fireplaces that stretched over the country. This time his knees remained firm upon the cold floor of Umbridge's office, and only his head hurtled through the emerald fire. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the spinning stopped. Feeling rather sick and as though he was wearing an exceptionally hot muffler around his head, Harry opened his eyes to find that he was looking up, out of the kitchen fireplace, at the long wooden table, where a man sat, poring over a piece of parchment. Sirius! The man jumped and looked around. It was not Sirius, but Lupin. Harry, he said, looking thoroughly shocked. What are you? What's happened? Is everything all right? Yes, said Harry. I just wondered, I just fancied a chat with Sirius. I'll call him, said Lupin, getting to his feet, still looking perplexed. He went upstairs to look for Creature. He seems to be hiding in the attic again. And Harry saw Lupin hurry out of the kitchen. Now he was left with nothing to look at but the chair and table legs. He wondered why Sirius had never mentioned how very uncomfortable it was to speak out of the fire. His knees were already objecting painfully to their prolonged contact with Umbridge's hard stone floor. Lupin returned with Sirius at his heels moments later. What is it? Said Sirius urgently, sweeping his long dark hair out of his eyes and dropping to the ground in front of the fire, so that he and Harry were on a level. Lupin knelt down too, looking very concerned. Are you all right? Do you need help? No, said Harry. It's nothing like that. I just wanted to talk. About my dad. They exchanged a look of great surprise, but Harry did not have time to feel awkward or embarrassed. His knees were becoming sorer by the second, and he guessed 5 minutes had already passed from the start of the diversion. George had only guaranteed him 20. He therefore plunged immediately into the story of what he had seen in the Pensieve. When he had finished, neither Sirius nor Lupin spoke for a moment. Then Lupin said quietly, I wouldn't like you to judge your father on what you saw there, Harry. He was only 15. I'm 15, said Harry heatedly. Look, Harry, said Sirius placatingly. James and Snape hated each other from the moment they set eyes on each other. It was just one of those things. You can understand that, can't you? I think James was everything Snape wanted to be. He was popular, he was good at Quidditch, good at pretty much everything. And Snape was just this little oddball who was up to his eyes in the dark arts, and James, whatever else he may have appeared to you, Harry, always hated the dark arts. Yeah, said Harry, but he just attacked Snape for no good reason, just because you said you were bored, he finished, with a slightly apologetic note in his voice. I'm not proud of it, said Sirius quickly. Lupin looked sideways at Sirius and then said, Look, Harry, what you've got to understand is that your father and Sirius were the best in the school at whatever they did. Everyone thought they were the height of cool. If they sometimes got a bit carried away... If we were sometimes arrogant little Burks, you mean, said Sirius. Lupin smiled. He kept messing up his hair, said Harry in a pained voice. Sirius and Lupin laughed. I'd forgotten he used to do that, said Sirius affectionately. Was he playing with the snitch? Said Lupin eagerly. Yeah, said Harry, watching uncomprehendingly as Sirius and Lupin beamed reminiscently. Well, I thought he was a bit of an idiot. Of course he was a bit of an idiot, said Sirius bracingly. We were all idiots. Well, not Moony so much, he said fairly, looking at Lupin. But Lupin shook his head. Did I ever tell you to lay off, Snape? He said. Did I ever have the guts to tell you I thought you were out of order? Yeah, well, said Sirius, you made us feel ashamed of ourselves sometimes. That was something. And, said Harry doggedly, determined to say everything that was on his mind now he was here. He kept looking over at the girls by the lake, hoping they were watching him. Oh, well, he always made a fool of himself whenever Lily was around, said Sirius, shrugging. He couldn't stop himself showing off whenever he got near her. How come she married him? Harry asked miserably. She hated him. No, she didn't, said Sirius. She started going out with him in the 7th year, said Lupin. Once James had deflated his head a bit, said Sirius, and stopped hexing people just for the fun of it, said Lupin. Even Snape, said Harry. Well, said Lupin slowly, Snape was a special case. He never lost an opportunity to curse James, so you couldn't really expect James to take that lying down, could you? And my mum was okay with that. She didn't know too much about it, to tell the truth, said Sirius. James didn't take Snape on dates with her and jinx him in front of her, did he? Sirius frowned at Harry, who was still looking unconvinced. Look, he said, your father was the best friend I ever had, and he was a good person. A lot of people are idiots at the age of 15. He grew out of it. Yeah, okay, said Harry heavily. I just never thought I'd feel sorry for Snape. Now you mention it, said Lupin, a faint crease between his eyebrows. How did Snape react when he found you'd seen all this? He told me he'd never teach me occlumency again, said Harry indifferently. Like that's a big disappointment. He what? Shouted Sirius, causing Harry to jump and inhale a mouthful of ashes. Are you serious, Harry? Said Lupin quickly. He stopped giving you lessons? "Yes," said Harry, surprised at what he considered a great overreaction. "But it's okay, I don't care. It's a bit of a relief to tell you that I'm coming up there to have a word with Snape," said Sirius forcefully, and he actually made to stand up. But Lupin wrenched him back down again. "If anyone's going to tell Snape, it will be me," he said firmly. "But Harry, first of all, you're going to go back to Snape and tell him that on no account is he to stop giving you lessons. When Dumbledore hears—" "I can't tell him that. He'd kill me," said Harry, outraged. "You didn't see him when we got out of the Pensieve." "Harry, there is nothing so important as you learning occlumency," said Lupin sternly. "Do you understand me? Nothing." Okay, said Harry, thoroughly discomposed, not to mention annoyed. I'll try and say something to him, but it won't be—" He fell silent. He could hear distant footsteps. "Is that creature coming downstairs?" "No," said Sirius, glancing behind him. "It must be somebody your end." Harry's heart skipped several beats. "I'd better go," he said hastily, and pulled his head backwards out of Grimmauld Place fire. For a moment his head seemed to be revolving on his shoulders. Then he found himself kneeling in front of Umbridge's fire, with it firmly back on, and watching the emerald flames flicker and die. "Quickly, quickly!" he heard a wheezy voice mutter right outside the office door. She's left it open." Harry dived for the invisibility cloak, and had just managed to pull it back over himself when Filch burst into the office. He looked absolutely delighted about something, and was talking to himself feverishly as he crossed the room, pulled open a drawer in Umbridge's desk, and began rifling through the papers inside it. "Approval for whipping! Approval for whipping! I can do it at last! They've had it coming to them for years!" He pulled out a piece of parchment, kissed it, then shuffled rapidly back into the door, clutching it to his chest. Harry leapt to his feet, and making sure he had his bag and that invisibility cloak was completely covering him, he wrenched open the door and hurried out of the office after Filch, who was hobbling along faster than Harry had ever seen him go. One landing down from Umbridge's office, Harry thought it was safe to become visible again. He pulled off the cloak, shoved it into his bag, and hurried onwards. There was a great deal of shouting and movement coming from the entrance hall. He ran down the marble staircase and found what looked like most of the school assembled there. It was just like the night when Trelawney had been sacked. Students were standing all around the walls in a great ring, some of them, Harry noticed, covered in substance that looked very like stink sap. Teachers and ghosts were also in the crowd. Prominent among the onlookers were members of the inquisitorial squad, who were all looking exceptionally pleased with themselves, and Peeves, who was bobbing overhead, gazed down at Fred and George, who stood in the middle of the floor with the unmistakable look of two people who had just been cornered. "So," said Umbridge triumphantly. Harry realised she was standing just a few stairs in front of him, once more looking down upon her prey. "So, you think it amusing to turn a school corridor into a swamp, do you?" "Pretty amusing, yeah," said Fred, looking up at her without the slightest sign of fear. Filch elbowed his way closer to Umbridge, almost crying with happiness. "I've got the form, headmistress," he said hoarsely, waving the piece of parchment Harry had just seen him take from her desk. "I've got the form, and I've got the whips waiting. Oh, let me do it now." "Very good, Argus," she said. "You two," she went on, gazing down at Fred and George, "are about to learn what happens to wrongdoers in any school. My school." "You know what," said Fred, "I don't think we are." He turned to his twin. "George," said Fred, "I think we've outgrown full-time education." "Yeah, I've been feeling that way myself," said George lightly. "Time to test our talents in the real world. Do you reckon?" asked Fred. "Definitely," said George. And before Umbridge could say a word, they raised their wands and said together, "Accio Brooms!" Harry heard a loud crash somewhere in the distance. Looking to his left, he ducked just in time. Fred and George's broomsticks, one still tailing and trailing in the heavy chain and iron peg from which Umbridge had fastened them to the wall, were hurtling along the corridor towards their owners. They turned left, streaked down the stairs, and stopped sharply in front of the twins, the chain clattering loudly on the flagstone floor. "We won't be seeing you," Fred told Professor Umbridge, swinging his leg over his broomstick. "Yeah, don't bother to keep in touch," said George, mounting his own. Fred looked around at the assembled students, at the silent, watchful crowd. If anyone fancies buying a portable swamp, as demonstrated upstairs, come to number 93, Diagon Alley, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, he said in a loud voice. Our new premises. Special discounts to Hogwarts students who swear they're going to use our products to get rid of this old bat, added George, pointing at Professor Umbridge. Stop them! Shrieked Umbridge. But it was too late. As the inquisitorial squad closed in, Fred and George kicked off from the floor, shooting 15 feet into the air, the iron peg swinging dangerously below. Fred looked across the hall at the poltergeist, bobbing on his level above the crowd. Give her hell from us, Peeves. And Peeves, who Harry had never seen take an order from a student before, swept his belled hat from his head and sprang to a salute as Fred and George wheeled about to tumultuous applause from the students below and sped out of the open front doors into the glorious sunset.